Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey deep into the annals of a kingdom teetering on the edge, ruled by a sovereign so utterly out of touch, they probably won't survive this. Imagine a glittering court, oblivious to the gathering storm, while a young man, cloaked in silks and utterly convinced of his divine right, dances on the precipice of disaster. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He sits upon a throne carved from ancient gnarled oak, its arms worn smooth by centuries of royal hands, yet his own grasp feels strangely loose. King Theron, as we shall call him, is barely more than a boy, his chin still showing the faintest hint of fuzz, his eyes, once bright with youthful wonder, now clouded by an entitlement so vast it practically has its own gravitational pull. He inherited this sprawling, beleaguered kingdom, not through any merit of his own, but by the simple, arbitrary lottery of birth. And, oh, what a lottery win it felt like to him. The crown, a heavy circlet of gold and jewels, rests awkwardly on his head, a little too big, perhaps a subtle hint from the universe that he wasn't quite ready for the role. But Theron doesn't notice. He's too busy admiring his reflection in the polished surface of a nearby silver goblet, his smile wide and utterly untroubled. His early reign, if one can even call it that, is less about governance and more about grand gestures and spectacular blunders. Imagine, if you will, a child given the keys to a magnificent but somewhat rickety mansion. Instead of checking the foundations or mending the leaky roof, he immediately sets about redecorating the ballroom with solid gold peacocks and ordering a new diamond-encrusted doorknob for the privy. That's Theron. The kingdom, meanwhile, groans under the weight of decades of neglect and recent bouts of famine, its treasury looking more like a dusty piggy bank with a few coppers rattling inside. But Theron, bless his cotton socks, believes implicitly that the wealth of the nation is simply there for his personal enjoyment. He genuinely thinks the royal coffers are an extension of his own allowance. One popular anecdote from the time, perhaps apocryphal but wonderfully illustrative, tells of him commissioning a life-size statue of his favourite pet parrot, complete with emerald eyes and a sapphire beak, at a cost that could have fed a small village for a month. When his exasperated treasurer, a stoic man named Master Elms, dared to gently suggest fiscal prudence, Theron simply waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense, Elms," he'd chirped. "The people love their king's extravagance. It shows them how prosperous we truly are." The court, a swirling eddy of sycophants and old money, largely lets him be. They've seen kings come and go, and most of them are far too comfortable in their gilded cages to rock the boat. They whisper behind silk fans, of course, about his latest folly, the annual royal duck parade, where specially bred ducks adorned with tiny jewelled collars would waddle through the palace gardens to the delight of precisely no one outside the royal family. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is the pervasive culture of omerta within royal courts, where criticising the monarch, no matter how foolish, was a direct path to ruin. This unspoken code ensured Theron remained blissfully ignorant of the true state of affairs. His advisers, those who weren't actively enriching themselves, simply nodded and smiled, offering bland reassurances. It was a vicious cycle of self-deception, fueled by fear and a healthy dose of courtly ambition. Theron, for his part, sees himself as a visionary. He envisions sprawling new gardens, magnificent fountains spouting scented waters, and banquets that last for days, featuring roasted swans and exotic fruits flown in from distant lands. He spends hours poring over architectural plans, not for new granaries or improved irrigation systems, mind you, but for an elaborate system of miniature canals and gondolas within the palace grounds, so he might be serenaded while gliding from his bedchamber to the breakfast hall. One quirky historical tidbit from this period involves his obsession with celestial music. He hired an entire troupe of musicians whose sole purpose was to play ethereal, atmospheric tunes, sometimes for an entire day, even if Theron himself was nowhere near. He claimed it improved the palace's spiritual aura. The irony, of course, is that while he dreams of gondolas, the rivers outside the capital are silting up, the bridges are crumbling, and the roads are becoming impassable. Merchants, the lifeblood of any kingdom, find their trade routes increasingly perilous, their goods plundered by opportunistic bandits. The small farmers, already struggling with poor harvests and oppressive taxes, watch their meagre crops wither, praying for rain that never seems to come. Yet news of these mundane troubles rarely penetrates the thick, soundproofed walls of the palace. When it does, it's typically filtered through so many layers of bureaucracy and courtly euphemism that it arrives sounding like a minor inconvenience, easily solved by another royal decree or perhaps a new tax on something. Theron is fond of new taxes. He views them as a convenient, magical faucet for money. Historians still argue whether Theron's early excesses were born of true malice, or simply a profound, almost childlike naivety. Was he a cruel tyrant, deliberately impoverishing his people, or merely a pampered idiot, utterly incapable of grasping the concept of consequences? The prevailing scholarly debate leans towards the latter, painting a picture of a man so shielded by privilege that he never developed the empathy or foresight necessary for effective rule. He genuinely believes that if the royal coffers are full, then the kingdom must be thriving. It's a bit like someone living in a mansion with a full fridge, completely unaware that the town outside is experiencing a blackout and a water shortage. His days are a leisurely drift from one pleasure to the next. He rises late, often after a night of revelry, his mornings dedicated to elaborate ablutions and the careful selection of his attire. Always the finest silks, embroidered with gold thread, sometimes even adorned with tiny actual pearls. Then comes a sprawling breakfast, followed by a light hunt in the royal forests, or perhaps a spirited game of royal tiddlywinks with his courtiers, a game he invariably wins, largely because no one dares to beat the king. The afternoons are for audiences, though these are typically brief and unsatisfying, as Theron quickly grows bored with matters of state. He prefers to discuss the latest fashion trends from the neighbouring kingdom of Eldoria, or perhaps debate the precise shade of blue for the new royal stables. The people, meanwhile, are not entirely oblivious to the absurdities unfolding within the palace. News travels, albeit slowly, through taverns and marketplaces. Whispers turn into murmurs, murmurs into grumbles. They hear tales of the king's new diamond-studded shoe buckles, while their own children go shoeless. They hear of banquets featuring rare migratory birds, while they pick through meagre rations of gruel. The disconnect is not just vast, it's a chasm, growing wider with each passing day. Theron, in his ivory tower, doesn't feel the chill winds of discontent, nor does he hear the rumble of distant thunder. He's too busy designing a new, more elaborate crown, one that will truly reflect the unparalleled majesty of his reign. He assumes his people are happy because, well, why wouldn't they be? He's their king, and a king in his mind is inherently good, inherently benevolent, and inherently rich. The seeds of discontent are being sown, not by rebellious agitators, but by the sheer, unadulterated foolishness of the monarch himself. The palace, a gleaming behemoth of white stone and polished marble, stands as a stark contrast to the burgeoning squalor beyond its manicured gardens. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of roasted meats, rare spices, and the heavy perfume worn by the ladies of the court. Outside, the scent is more of wood smoke, stale sweat, and desperation. The whispers, which once merely buzzed among the lower echelons of the court, now grow louder, bolder, creeping into the very antechambers of power. Courtiers, who once merely rolled their eyes at Theron's latest folly, now exchange worried glances. The chief minister, a portly man named Lord Valerius with a perpetually furrowed brow, finds himself increasingly unable to maintain his usual placid demeanour. He watches Theron parade about, dressed as a shepherd for a pastoral-themed banquet, complete with a bejewelled crook, and feels a cold dread settle in his stomach. Lord Valerius, unlike many of his counterparts, has a genuine, if somewhat cynical, love for the kingdom. He understands that a king's stability is often predicated on the illusion of his competence, and Theron is shattering that illusion with the subtlety of a runaway siege engine. He sees the growing resentment in the eyes of the palace guards, men who once served with unquestioning loyalty but now mutter darkly about unpaid wages and families going hungry. He hears the merchants, once eager to secure royal patronage, now openly complaining about arbitrary tariffs and the constant requisitioning of their goods for the king's endless parties. This isn't just a bad king, Valerius realises. This is a king actively dismantling the very foundations of his rule, brick by expensive brick. The court, despite its general complacency, cannot completely ignore the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. They notice the dwindling number of petitioners at the gates, not because problems have vanished, but because people have lost faith that the king will offer any meaningful redress. They see the occasional small protest outside the palace walls, quickly dispersed by the royal guard, but the frequency is increasing. A mainstream historical fact is that societal unrest rarely erupts without a prolonged period of simmering discontent, often exacerbated by visible discrepancies between the lives of the rulers and the ruled. Theron, by his very existence, is providing a masterclass in how to accelerate this process. Theron, of course, perceives none of this. He lives in a bubble of affirmation, where every burp is a symphony and every childish doodle a masterpiece. His favourite pastime now is commissioning elaborate theatrical productions within the palace, often starring himself in the lead role, usually as a victorious general or a wise sage, roles completely antithetical to his real-life persona. He insists on historical accuracy for these plays, ironically, down to the last button, yet demonstrates absolutely no interest in the real history unfolding outside his very windows. One quirky historical tidbit often recounted is that during one such play, depicting a famous battle, Theron ordered live pigeons to be released to simulate arrows, much to the dismay of the stagehands and the palace cleaners. He thought it added authentic chaos. His queen, a demure woman named Elara, chosen for her beauty and quiet nature from a minor noble house, tries occasionally to gently steer him towards more pressing matters. She'd mention the rising price of grain, or the increasing banditry on the roads. Theron would merely pat her hand, offer a dismissive smile, and assure her that such matters were best left to the men. He genuinely believes that her role is to look beautiful and provide heirs, not to concern herself with the tiresome business of governing. Elara, a clever woman beneath her quiet exterior, slowly retreats into herself, spending her days tending to her gardens and her children, a silent witness to the impending disaster. She communicates mostly through her expressions now. A subtle tightening of her lips, a flicker of concern in her eyes, signals that Theron, unsurprisingly, completely misses. The kingdom's coffers, which Theron imagines to be an inexhaustible spring, are in fact a stagnant pond rapidly drying up. Lord Valerius attempts, with increasing desperation, to explain the concept of deficits, of outgoings exceeding income, but it's like trying to explain quantum physics to a particularly pampered cat. Theron simply smiles, orders another gold-plated carriage, and declares, "Then we shall simply raise more taxes." The common people, already burdened, find themselves squeezed even further. Taxes on bread, on salt, on the very air they breathe, it seems. And for what? To fund another extravagant ball, another jewel for the Queen's already overflowing casket, another ridiculous pet project like the royal maze of endless wonder, which quickly becomes overgrown and filled with palace cats. Historians still argue whether the court's complicity was born primarily of fear or ambition. Many courtiers were undoubtedly terrified of Theron's unpredictable temper, while others saw an opportunity to enrich themselves at the kingdom's expense, believing they could jump ship when the true storm hit. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario. Did their flattery enable his foolishness, or did his inherent foolishness create an environment where only flattery could survive? The truth, as always, is likely a messy combination of both. Meanwhile, news from the provinces paints a grim picture. Reports of crop failures, outbreaks of fever, and villages abandoned due to brigandage filter back, but they are often downplayed or simply ignored. The messengers, weary and covered in dust, are often made to wait for days outside the royal chambers, only to be dismissed with a wave of the hand or a terse instruction to deal with it. Theron, in his insulated world, cannot fathom that people are genuinely suffering. He sees the world through the lens of his own limitless comfort. If he is comfortable, surely everyone else must be too. It's a bit like believing that because your mansion has air conditioning, the entire city block must also be cool. The growing discontent isn't just about money, it's about dignity. The constant visible display of royal excess while ordinary people starve fuels a deep burning resentment. Imagine working tirelessly, tilling barren land, only to hear that your king has just commissioned a new set of solid gold chess pieces, each pawn adorned with a tiny diamond. It's not just unfair, it feels like a deliberate insult. The grumblers in the taverns are no longer just complaining about taxes, they are questioning the very legitimacy of Theron's rule. They ask, does he truly care for us? Is he truly fit to lead? and the answers they find are increasingly damning. Lord Valerius, seeing the writing on the wall, makes one last, desperate attempt to reason with the king. He compiles an exhaustive report detailing the kingdom's financial woes, the dwindling public support, and the rising tide of banditry. He presents it to Theron during one of his rare moments of lucidity, hoping to appeal to some vestige of royal responsibility. Theron glances at the thick document, sighs dramatically, and then, with a dismissive flick of his wrist, pushes it aside. "Too many numbers, Valerius," he declares. "My eyes grow weary." "Besides, are we not magnificent? Look at this palace. Look at my robes. Does this look like a kingdom in decline?" He genuinely believes that outward appearances are the ultimate indicator of national health. It's a bit like someone polishing the hood of a car while the engine is actively on fire. Valerius defeated bows and withdraws, a chilling premonition settling upon him. He knows with grim certainty that the whispers of discontent will soon become shouts, and the shouts will inevitably become roars. The king's foolishness, once merely an amusing eccentricity to the court, is now a dangerous contagious disease, weakening the kingdom's immune system and leaving it vulnerable to the slightest external shock. The calm before the storm is a deceitful one, filled with the soft clinking of royal goblets and the rustle of silk gowns, but beneath it the ground trembles. The stage is set for a truly spectacular downfall, orchestrated not by external enemies, but by the very hand that wears the crown. And Theron, oblivious to the gathering clouds, continues to play his celestial music, blissfully unaware that the symphony of his destruction is already tuning up. The royal decree, when it finally arrived, was less a carefully considered policy, and more a thunderclap of monumental cluelessness. Theron, in a fit of what he believed to be profound economic insight, had decided the kingdom's financial woes could be solved by forcing everyone to wear specific colours. His logic, if one can even dignify it with such a term, was that by regulating the hues of fabric sold and worn, he could stimulate a new, vibrant textile industry, and more importantly, collect a hefty royal tariff on every bolt of approved cloth. He envisioned a kingdom shimmering in coordinated pastels, a veritable living tapestry of his own design. The proclamation, drafted by scribes with expressions ranging from barely concealed amusement to outright despair, was titled The Edict of Harmonious Hues and Regal Revenues. It mandated that, effective immediately, only specific shades of violet, gold, and a particularly insipid shade of periwinkle blue could be produced or worn by the common populace. Royal blue, crimson, and true emerald green were, of course, reserved exclusively for the nobility. The impact was predictably catastrophic. Imagine for a moment a bustling marketplace. Before the edict it was a riot of colour, a vibrant tapestry of reds, blues, greens and browns, reflecting regional dyes and personal preferences. After the edict it transformed into a muted, almost depressing palette of state-approved monotony. The immediate consequence was the decimation of the existing textile industry. Dyers, weavers and tailors, who had spent generations perfecting their craft with a myriad of colours, found themselves unable to sell their vibrant stock. Their livelihood depended on the very diversity Theron was now outlawing. Moreover, the raw materials for the approved colours were often rare or expensive, requiring specialised imported dyes that few local artisans could afford. This wasn't just an economic blunder, it was a cultural affront, striking at the heart of local traditions and craftsmanship. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is how frequently seemingly innocuous sumptuary laws regulating consumption, have inadvertently triggered economic collapse or social unrest by stifling trade and innovation. Theron's decree was a textbook example. The peasants, already struggling to put food on their tables, suddenly faced an additional burden. Their worn, patched clothing, lovingly dyed with natural earth tones, was now illegal. To comply, they would have to purchase new garments, made from the king's approved colours, at exorbitant prices. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a demand for the impossible from people who had no excess to spare. Farmers, who spent their days caked in mud, were now expected to parade around in periwinkle. The sheer absurdity of it, combined with the crushing financial strain, ignited a slow, burning fury. Lord Valerius, who had tried desperately to argue against the edict, had been dismissed from court for his lack of artistic vision. Theron, ever the benevolent tyrant, had merely laughed. declaring that Valerius simply didn't understand the aesthetic power of a truly unified kingdom. He genuinely believed he was a patron of the arts, rather than a wrecking ball to the economy. He spent days personally inspecting fabric samples, debating the exact shade of regal violet with bewildered merchants who just wanted to sell their existing inventory. One quirky historical tidbit from this time is that Theron, to ensure compliance, dispatched royal fashion inspectors, courtiers with no real expertise beyond their own wardrobes, into the villages to fine anyone caught wearing an unapproved shade. These inspectors were often ridiculed, sometimes openly pelted with rotten vegetables, a clear sign of the people's contempt. The marketplace, once a lively hub of commerce and gossip, grew quiet. Stalls stood empty. Goods lay unsold. The grand textile houses in the capital, which had once churned out bolts of luxurious silks and fine wools, now faced bankruptcy. The royal coffers, instead of filling with regal revenues, saw a dramatic decrease in all other forms of tax income as businesses failed and trade ground to a halt. It was a classic example of cutting off your nose to spite your face, if your face was the entire national economy. Theron, however, attributed the decline to a temporary lack of public enthusiasm for his brilliant initiative. He never considered that his subjects might be too busy starving to appreciate his colour scheme. Historians still argue whether Theron's edict of harmonious hues was a deliberate attempt to assert absolute control, a misguided economic experiment, or simply the bizarre whim of an insulated fool. While some scholars point to his general disregard for the common people, most agree it was born of profound ignorance rather than malice. He simply couldn't conceive of a world where his brilliant ideas wouldn't magically fix everything. He genuinely believed that if he ordered it, it would happen, and if it didn't, it was merely because people weren't trying hard enough. The edict had unforeseen consequences far beyond the economic. It fostered a deep sense of defiance. People began to wear their old, unapproved clothes with a quiet pride, a subtle act of rebellion. Old women, too frail to earn enough for new garments, would mend their faded blue aprons with patches of forbidden green, a silent protest sewn into the very fabric of their lives. The royal fashion inspectors, instead of inspiring fear, became figures of ridicule and resentment. Their arbitrary fines only fueled the anger. The king, who had hoped to create a visual testament to his power, had instead created a uniform of defiance. It was a bit like trying to make everyone wear a clown nose, only to find they'd all decided to wear it upside down. This single foolish decree, more than any other, began to erode the last vestiges of loyalty among the common folk. It wasn't just the money, it was the insult to their intelligence, the blatant disregard for their suffering, and the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of a king who believed he could dictate the very colour of their lives. It showed them, unequivocally, that he was not just out of touch but actively hostile to their well-being. The whispers in the taverns turned from grumbles about taxes to outright calls for change. The king, once merely a distant, slightly foolish figure, was now becoming an active oppressor. The absurdity of the situation reached its zenith when a delegation of weavers from the distant province of Viridian, famous for their vibrant green dyes, arrived at the capital, pleading for an exemption. Their entire livelihood, their generational craft, depended on a colour now deemed illegal. Theron, receiving them in his personal colour studio, a chamber where he experimented with different fabric swatches, merely chuckled. "My dear sirs," he declared, "Viridian green is indeed a fine colour for a forest perhaps, but not for a kingdom. You must learn to adapt. Perhaps try a lovely periwinkle." The weavers, their faces grim, returned to their province, their pleas unheard, their hopes crushed. This refusal to even listen was a turning point for many, solidifying the idea that the king simply did not care. It was a bit like asking a fish to live on land because you've decided the ocean is no longer aesthetically pleasing. The economic ripple effects were profound. With textiles in decline, related industries suffered. Merchants who transported dyes and raw materials found their routes empty. Farmers who grew flax and wool found no buyers. The once thriving markets began to resemble ghost towns. The royal treasury, instead of swelling, continued its alarming decline. Lord Valerius, now a private citizen, could only watch in despair from his country estate as the kingdom unravelled. He received clandestine reports from former colleagues, detailing the spiralling crisis, and each dispatch confirmed his worst fears. The Edict of Harmonious Hues, intended to be a beacon of royal brilliance, had become a monument to royal idiocy, a testament to a king who valued superficial appearance over fundamental stability. The common people, pushed to their limits, began to see Theron not as a divinely appointed ruler, but as a capricious child playing with their lives. The respect for the crown, once a deep-seated tradition, began to fray. The bonds between ruler and ruled, already weakened by years of neglect, now snapped under the strain of an absurd and oppressive law. This single, ludicrous decree sealed his fate in the minds of many. It demonstrated, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was utterly incapable of leading, utterly unwilling to listen, and utterly undeserving of their loyalty. The stage was set, not just for discontent, but for outright rebellion. The storm clouds, once distant whispers, were now directly overhead, heavy with the promise of rain, or perhaps something far more destructive. In the midst of this escalating absurdity, a different kind of folly blossomed within the palace walls, a grand romance. Not a love born of shared ideals or deep understanding, but one steeped in infatuation, vanity, and an almost pathological need for constant adoration. Theron, whose emotional intelligence was roughly equivalent to a particularly dull brick, became utterly captivated by a visiting princess from a neighbouring minor principality, Princess Isolde. She possessed a beauty so ethereal it almost seemed to shimmer, with hair like spun moonlight and eyes the colour of a summer sky. She was, in essence, everything Theron believed a princess should be: exquisite, refined, and utterly devoted to him, or at least exceptionally good at feigning it. The moment Theron saw her, during a state banquet where he was supposed to be discussing vital trade agreements, the world outside his own immediate desires ceased to exist. He neglected his duties, abandoned his already flimsy attempts at governance, and plunged headfirst into a whirlwind courtship that would make even the most cynical courtier blush. It was less a romance and more a performance piece, starring Theron as the valiant, love-struck king and Isolde as his dazzling, appreciative audience. He showered her with gifts, jewels plundered from the royal treasury, exotic birds in gilded cages, and dresses woven from the finest silks, dyed, of course, in the legally mandated periwinkle and violet, much to Isolde's quiet dismay. A mainstream historical fact is that interroyal marriages were almost always political, designed to secure alliances or territories. Theron, however, treated this as a personal passion project, completely ignoring its strategic implications or lack thereof. The lavish spending on Isolde beggared belief, even for a kingdom already on the brink of insolvency. Banquets were held nightly in her honour, each more extravagant than the last, featuring delicacies imported at ruinous cost. Musicians played for her alone, poets composed odes to her beauty, and artists were commissioned to paint her portrait a dozen times over, often with Theron gazing adoringly from the background. He even ordered the construction of an entirely new wing of the palace, dedicated solely to her collection of exotic flowers, requiring the forced labour of hundreds of peasants. This ostentatious display, visible to all, served only to highlight the vast chasm between the king's self-indulgent fantasy and the stark reality of his subjects' suffering. It was a bit like throwing a Gatsby-esque party while your entire town is facing eviction notices. Isolde, for her part, played her role flawlessly. She smiled sweetly, murmured appropriate compliments, and allowed Theron to believe he was the most charming, powerful, and desirable man in the world. Whether she genuinely cared for him is a matter of historical debate. Historians still argue whether Isolde was a cynical opportunist, or merely a young woman trapped by circumstances, simply doing what was necessary to survive and perhaps even thrive in a volatile court. What is certain is that she understood Theron's insatiable need for flattery, and fed it with a masterful hand. She became his constant shadow, his sounding board, and his most trusted and most dangerous confidant. This love story further isolated Theron from any semblance of reality. With Isolde by his side, whispering sweet nothings and praising his every foolish idea, he became even more impervious to criticism. She encouraged his extravagance, praising his generosity and magnificent taste. If Lord Valerius or any other sensible advisor tried to warn him about the financial drain, Isolde would subtly interject, suggesting that such matters were unworthy of His Majesty's noble spirit, or that true love knows no limits. She was, in essence, the ultimate enabler, a beautiful siren lulling Theron further onto the rocks. The impact on the commoners was devastating. The cost of Isolde's upkeep, her endless gowns, her rare perfumes, and her personal retinue of servants all came directly from the increasingly empty royal treasury, which meant, ultimately, from the pockets of the already impoverished populace. New taxes were levied specifically to fund her whims: the jewel tax, the perfume levy, even a royal promenade contribution, ostensibly for the upkeep of the garden she would stroll through. These were not just financial burdens, they were symbolic insults, tangible proof that the king cared more for a pretty face than for his suffering people. One quirky historical tidbit from this period revolves around Theron's attempt to impress Isolde with his intellectual prowess. He commissioned a personal library of entirely blank books, bound in rare leathers and embossed with gold, explaining that true wisdom lies not in the words of others, but in the thoughts one places within oneself. Isolde somehow managed to praise this as profoundly avant-garde. The actual scholars in the kingdom, who desperately needed funds for actual books and research, were left utterly bewildered and increasingly resentful. The whispers of discontent now had a new focus: the foreign princess. She became, fairly or unfairly, a lightning rod for the people's anger. They saw her as a symbol of the king's detached decadence, an outsider draining their resources for her own vanity. Songs and rhymes mocking her lavishness, and the king's besotted foolishness began to circulate in the taverns and marketplaces, passed from mouth to mouth, growing sharper with each retelling. These weren't just playful jests, they were expressions of deep, seething resentment, chipping away at the very legitimacy of the monarchy. Theron, of course, was oblivious. He was too busy composing bad poetry for Isolde, or commissioning a new, even larger fountain in her honour, one that would spray not water, but scented wine on special occasions. He genuinely believed that his love for Isolde was a source of strength for the kingdom, an example of royal romance that would inspire his people. He saw himself as a grand, romantic figure, utterly unaware that he was becoming a tragicomic figure, pitied by some, despised by many. It was a bit like declaring your love by buying a super yacht when you can't even afford to keep the lights on in your own house. The nobility too felt the pinch. While they benefited from the lavish court life, the increasing demands on their own coffers to maintain appearances and contribute to the king's excesses started to wear thin. Their lands were neglected, their own finances strained. They saw the public anger growing and worried that the king's obsession with Isolde was blinding him to the very real dangers that lay ahead. Some began to quietly distance themselves, feigning illness or urgent business in their country estates, hoping to avoid being too closely associated with the ship as it began to take on water. They saw the handwriting on the wall, even if Theron was too busy writing love letters to notice. This period of the royal romance was a crucial turning point. It solidified Theron's image as a king utterly consumed by personal gratification, indifferent to the suffering of his subjects. The economic damage was profound and irreversible. The Edict of Harmonious Hues had crippled industries. The endless spending on Isolde had emptied the treasury. The kingdom was not just struggling, it was bleeding out, slowly but surely, while its monarch was too busy mooning over his beloved to notice the life draining away. Lord Valerius, receiving reports from his dwindling network of loyal contacts, heard of the growing unrest in the countryside. Small bands of dispossessed farmers and artisans, driven to desperation, were starting to coalesce. They were not yet an organised rebellion, but the seeds were being sown. The public's patience, already stretched thin, was now reaching its breaking point. The visible symbol of Theron's foolishness, the beautiful Princess Isolde, inadvertently became the catalyst that pushed simmering resentment into active defiance. It was a cruel irony that the object of his infatuation contributed so heavily to his undoing. The lavish parties continued, the music played, and Theron, with Isolde draped on his arm, danced merrily towards his inevitable and entirely self-inflicted doom. While Theron was busy perfecting his love-struck gaze and commissioning yet another gemstone-encrusted trinket for Princess Isolde, the kingdom outside the palace gates was quietly, steadily unravelling. The economic hardship, initially a dull ache, had festered into a deep, agonising wound. The Edict of Harmonious Hues had choked commerce, and the relentless, often arbitrary taxes imposed to fund royal extravagance had bled the populace dry. It wasn't just a matter of tightening belts. For many, there were no more holes left on the belt, and hunger gnawed at their insides. The first signs were subtle. easily dismissed by those who preferred to remain comfortably blind. Small bands of dispossessed farmers, unable to pay their taxes or feed their families, abandoned their fields and drifted towards the cities, hoping for work that simply didn't exist. These were the hungry ones, recognisable by their gaunt faces and the desperation in their eyes. They congregated in the poorer districts, their numbers swelling daily, a silent testament to the king's utter failure. A mainstream historical fact is that mass migrations from rural areas to urban centres, often driven by economic distress, frequently precede periods of significant social upheaval. Theron, however, saw only fewer people in the fields, which he cheerfully interpreted as a sign of agricultural efficiency. Then came the petty crimes, a nervous cough before the full-blown fever. A baker whose family was starving might pilfer a sack of flour from a lord's granary. A desperate mother might be caught stealing a few vegetables from a market stall. These acts, once rare, became increasingly common, driven not by malice but by sheer survival. The local magistrates themselves, often struggling, found it harder and harder to mete out justice. How do you punish a man for stealing bread when his children are crying from hunger? The traditional respect for law and order, a bedrock of any stable society, began to crack under the immense pressure of widespread need. Theron, of course, remained blissfully unaware. His days were filled with the effervescent joy of his romance and the meticulous planning of the next royal spectacle. He genuinely believed that the sporadic reports of minor disturbances were simply the usual grumblings of a populace that didn't fully appreciate his benevolent rule. His advisers, those few who remained and dared to speak, would present him with reports of unrest, but Theron would skim them, declare them overly dramatic, and then change the subject to the new, diamond-encrusted collars he was designing for the royal hounds. One quirky historical tidbit: Theron once proposed that if people were truly hungry, they should simply eat more cake. When it was pointed out that cake was a luxury, he suggested they try a particularly rich spiced fruit bread from his own breakfast table instead, believing it was a universal staple. The discontent, once expressed in whispers and desperate acts, began to coalesce into more organised forms. Displaced peasants, unemployed artisans and disillusioned soldiers, many of whom hadn't received their full pay in months, started to gather in informal groups. They met in hushed taverns, in abandoned barns, and in the deep woods, sharing their grievances, their anger slowly solidifying into a shared purpose. They spoke of the exorbitant taxes, the crumbling infrastructure, the king's endless parties, and the ever-present hunger. These were not intellectual debates. They were raw, visceral expressions of a people pushed to their breaking point. These small uprisings, initially sporadic and isolated, were easily dismissed by the detached ruler. A village refusing to pay its taxes would be met with a detachment of royal guards, quickly quelling the defiance. A small group of angry farmers marching towards the capital would be intercepted and dispersed. These incidents were logged in the palace records as peasant revolts, minor annoyances to be swiftly crushed. Theron viewed them as momentary lapses in loyalty, easily corrected with a show of force. He never paused to consider why these acts of defiance were happening, only that they needed to be stopped. It was a bit like swatting at individual flies while ignoring the rotting carcass attracting the entire swarm. Historians still argue whether Theron's consistent underestimation of these early uprisings was a failure of intelligence gathering, a profound lack of empathy, or simply a stubborn refusal to believe that his people could ever truly turn against him. While the royal intelligence network was certainly poor, the consensus leans towards his psychological inability to accept any flaw in his own rule or popularity. He genuinely believed he was loved, despite all evidence to the contrary. He saw himself as a benevolent father figure, and his subjects as unruly children needing occasional discipline. The most egregious example of his dismissal came during a particularly cold winter. Reports flooded the capital of widespread starvation in the northern provinces. Entire families were perishing. Rather than dispatching aid or halting tax collection, Theron decided to hold a grand winter festival of abundance within the palace. He ordered the roasting of a dozen oxen, the flowing of hundreds of barrels of wine, and commanded his court to dance and sing with unrestrained gaiety. He genuinely believed that this display of royal prosperity would inspire hope in his suffering subjects, a kind of trickle-down festivity. The reality was, of course, that the smoke from his massive outdoor feasting pits drifted over the starving city, a pungent, agonizing reminder of his indifference. The common folk observing this callous display saw not inspiration, but a glaring, unbridgeable divide. The sight of heavily laden carriages brimming with exotic foodstuffs, rumbling past emaciated figures shivering in the snow, etched a deep, unforgiving resentment into their hearts. This was not a king, they realised. This was a parasite feeding on their misery. The small uprisings, once easily contained, began to gain a new kind of momentum, fueled by this festering anger. They were no longer just about survival, they were about justice. The seeds of rebellion, initially scattered and fragile, were now being watered by the king's own actions. Disillusioned soldiers, seeing the plight of their own families, quietly began to desert their posts, some even joining the nascent groups of disaffected citizens. Former artisans, masters of their craft, now honed their skills for a different purpose, perhaps forging crude weapons instead of artistic metalwork. The network of discontent was expanding slowly but surely, connecting disparate groups into a larger, more formidable force. Theron, meanwhile, was obsessed with a new project, a massive, jewel-encrusted clock for the palace tower, designed to chime every hour with a recording of his own laughter. He saw it as a symbol of his eternal happiness and prosperity, a kind of sonic monument to his reign. The cost of this monstrosity, of course, was astronomical, drawing even more resources from a kingdom that desperately needed them for actual life-sustaining purposes. He was, in essence, building a golden gravestone while his kingdom was collapsing around him. The court, increasingly nervous, could feel the rising tension. The whispers now included frantic discussions about escape routes, about hidden caches of gold, about potential allies outside the kingdom should the unthinkable happen. Even Princess Isolde, usually so composed, showed rare flashes of unease. She would subtly question Theron about the mood of the people, but he would simply brush off her concerns with a wave of his hand and a reassuring, if utterly deluded, smile. "Nonsense, my dearest," he would say. "They adore me. These little troubles are merely the growing pains of a truly magnificent kingdom." This period, marked by Theron's self-imposed ignorance and the escalating desperation of his people, was the point of no return. The isolated pockets of unrest were beginning to merge, forming a single, dangerous current. The king's persistent dismissal of their suffering, coupled with his brazen displays of excess, had irrevocably broken the social contract. Loyalty had evaporated, replaced by a potent cocktail of hunger, anger, and a burning desire for retribution. The kingdom was no longer simply struggling. It was on the cusp of an explosion, and Theron, the architect of his own destruction, continued to light the fuse, oblivious to the inferno he was about to unleash. As the rumblings of discontent grew louder across the kingdom, Theron, with an uncanny ability to choose the worst possible moment for major decisions, turned his gaze outward. He became convinced that the solution to his internal woes lay not in domestic reform, but in a grand, triumphant display of international power. His eyes fell upon the modest, yet strategically located neighbouring principality of Viridia. Viridia, while small, controlled vital trade routes and possessed rich mineral deposits, particularly the vibrant green dyes that Theron had so foolishly outlawed in his own kingdom. Its ruler, Prince Kael, was known for his astute diplomacy and his quiet, unostentatious strength. Theron, ever the master of self-delusion, didn't see Viridia as a potential trading partner or an ally. He saw it as a prize, a jewel to be added to his increasingly tarnished crown. His advisers, those who remained, watched in horrified silence as he conjured up a plan. Not an invasion, not yet, but a political manoeuvre so clumsy and short-sighted it bordered on parody. He decided to force a marriage alliance between his cousin, a rather plain and perpetually bored duke named Leopold, and Kael's eldest daughter, Princess Lyra. The terms, as dictated by Theron, were less a negotiation and more a royal ultimatum. Viridia would cede control of its trade routes, its mines, and pay a hefty annual tribute in exchange for this honour. It was, in essence, an annexation disguised as a wedding. Prince Kael, naturally, was appalled. He was a man of peace, but also a man of honour, and Theron's demands were a blatant insult, bordering on an act of war. Kael politely but firmly refused, citing the long-standing independence of Viridia and the unreasonableness of the terms. Theron, however, interpreted this refusal not as a principled stand, but as a personal affront, a challenge to his divine authority. His vanity, already colossal, swelled to dangerous proportions. he declared Kyle insolent and unfit to rule, and began to openly contemplate punitive measures. A mainstream historical fact is that many conflicts throughout history have ignited not from calculated geopolitical strategy, but from the personal pride and wounded egos of monarchs. Theron was merely adding another chapter to this unfortunate chronicle. It was at this critical juncture that a new, insidious voice entered Theron's ear. A charismatic, ambitious, and utterly ruthless general named Lord Vorlag. Vorlag, unlike Theron's increasingly cautious traditional advisors, saw opportunity in the king's megalomania. He flattered Theron's ego, praising his unrivaled vision and assuring him that Viridia would fall easily, eager to bask in the glorious light of Theron's rule. Vorlag spoke of swift military victories, of plunder filling the coffers, and of the king's name being whispered with awe across the continent. He painted a picture of glory and effortless triumph, precisely what Theron, in his desperate need for affirmation, longed to hear. He was, in essence, the devil on Theron's shoulder, whispering exactly what the foolish king wanted to believe. Theron, intoxicated by Vorlag's flattery and the intoxicating prospect of an easy victory, swallowed the bait whole. He appointed Vorlag his chief military advisor, sidelining the more experienced but less enthusiastic generals who warned of the logistical difficulties and the potential for a protracted conflict. These cautious voices were dismissed as cowards and lacking in spirit. Theron genuinely believed that his mere royal presence, combined with Vorlag's strategic genius, which was largely an illusion, would guarantee victory. One quirky historical tidbit from this period is that Theron commissioned a special ceremonial battle standard for the campaign, embroidered with the image of a majestic lion, a creature he had, ironically, never seen in person. He even ordered matching lion mane wigs for his generals. The alliance, or rather the forced pact that Theron formed, was less about strategic advantage and more about a desperate grasp for power. He leveraged his dwindling prestige to cajole a few minor impoverished city-states on his eastern border to join his planned Viridian glorification campaign. These city-states, desperate for any shred of Theron's increasingly worthless gold, reluctantly agreed, providing a small number of ill-equipped soldiers and ancient siege engines. They were, in truth, more of a liability than an asset, a motley collection of reluctant mercenaries and worn-out conscripts. Theron, however, trumpeted this grand coalition as proof of his widespread influence. It was a bit like boasting about having a full dance card when all your partners are there under duress and stepping on your toes. The decision to embark on this military adventure was, for the kingdom, a death knell. The treasury, already ravaged by Theron's personal extravagances and the Edict of Harmonious Hues, was now to be utterly depleted on war preparations. Food supplies, already scarce due to poor harvests and disruption, were requisitioned for the army, leaving the common people even more desperate. The conscription of able-bodied men, many of whom were the sole providers for their families, further exacerbated the economic and social crisis. Families were torn apart, farms lay fallow, and resentment festered into open hatred. Historians still argue whether Vorlag genuinely believed in Theron's plan, or if he was simply exploiting the king's weakness for his own advancement. While his subsequent actions suggest a keen opportunism, it's plausible he initially saw a chance for personal glory that aligned with Theron's grandiose ambitions. What is clear is that he was a dangerous influence, feeding the king's worst instincts and guiding him down a path of self-destruction. The kingdom's military, once a respected force, had been neglected for years. Its training was outdated, its equipment shoddy, and its morale low. The professional soldiers, what few remained, were demoralised by unpaid wages and the constant changes in leadership. Theron, however, saw only the magnificent uniforms he had designed for them, lavishly embroidered but utterly impractical for actual combat. He spent hours overseeing parades, admiring the gleaming armour and the synchronised marching, oblivious to the fact that a well-dressed soldier does not necessarily make a victorious army. He genuinely believed that aesthetics trumped strategy. It's a bit like commissioning a beautiful ornate lifeboat while the ship is rapidly sinking. The common people, who had suffered silently for so long, could not comprehend the king's reasoning. Why attack a peaceful neighbour, especially when their own families were starving? The prospect of war brought only further misery and bloodshed, not glory. The earlier whispers of discontent now escalated into outright condemnation. Anti-war pamphlets, crudely printed but passionately worded, began to circulate, denouncing the king's warmongering and his callous disregard for his own subjects. The army, instead of being seen as protectors, was increasingly viewed as an instrument of the king's oppression. Princess Isolde, surprisingly, showed a rare moment of genuine concern during this period. She discreetly tried to dissuade Theron from the war, suggesting that a peaceful alliance would be more beneficial. Perhaps she foresaw the disaster, or perhaps she simply feared for her own comfortable position should the kingdom fall. Theron, however, dismissed her concerns with a patronising pat on the head. "My dear," he said, "these are matters of state, too complex for your delicate understanding. Besides, think of the glory. A victorious king is a truly irresistible king." Her attempt, however minor, was a fleeting glimpse of sanity in an increasingly insane court, swiftly overridden by Theron's boundless ego and Vorlag's machinations. The drums of war began to beat, not just physically, but metaphorically, reverberating through every corner of the kingdom. The forced conscriptions, the confiscation of supplies, the endless taxes for military campaigns, each act chipped away at the last vestiges of public trust. The people understood, with grim certainty, that this war was not for their benefit, but for the king's vanity. It was a war that would cost them everything, only to secure a victory that would mean nothing for their daily lives, perhaps even making them worse. Theron, meanwhile, remained in his palace, poring over maps of Viridia he barely understood, dreaming of the triumphal arches that would greet his victorious return. He commissioned elaborate victory parades even before a single battle had been fought. He was, in short, planning the party before he'd even sent out the invitations, or, more accurately, before he'd even figured out how to get to the party. The stage was now set not just for conflict, but for the complete and utter collapse of his reign. The ill-fated alliance with Lord Vorlag and the declaration of war against a peaceful neighbour were the final decisive steps on Theron's accelerated path to infamy. The sound of distant thunder was no longer just a warning, it was the opening salvo of his undoing. The trumpets blared, a ragged, off-key fanfare echoing through the capital's main square. King Theron, resplendent in a newly commissioned gold-plated breastplate, entirely impractical for actual combat but undeniably shiny, sat atop a magnificent white stallion, itself bedecked in velvet and silver. This was the glorious commencement of his Viridian glorification campaign, a war he genuinely believed would be little more than a grand parade followed by an even grander victory feast. The streets were lined, not with cheering throngs, but with a sparse, silent crowd, their faces grim and wary. They watched the soldiers march past, their eyes hollow, their uniforms patched, and knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that this was not a war of glory but of ruin. General Vorlag, riding beside the king, cut a striking figure. His armour was practical, his gaze sharp, and a thin, predatory smile played on his lips. He was the only one in the royal party who seemed to understand the true nature of what was unfolding. He saw the weak link in Theron's chain of command, the ill-trained recruits, the shoddy equipment, and the pervasive low morale. But he also saw opportunity, a chance to forge his own destiny from the ashes of the king's folly. He had advised Theron to lead from the front, knowing full well that the king's presence would be a logistical nightmare and a morale drain. Theron, mistaking Vorlag's cunning for genuine admiration, had readily agreed, eager to bask in the perceived heroism of leading his troops. A mainstream historical fact is that many disastrous military campaigns have been initiated by rulers with little to no practical military experience, driven by vanity or overconfidence. Theron's campaign was shaping up to be a prime example. The march itself was an immediate indicator of the kingdom's unpreparedness. Roads, neglected for years due to the diversion of funds to royal frivolities, were crumbling and often impassable. Wagons carrying supplies bogged down in mud, their wheels splintering. The soldiers, already poorly fed, suffered from exposure and illness. Their rations, meant to last for weeks, dwindled rapidly, often plundered by opportunistic locals or simply spoiled due to inadequate storage. Theron, however, was insulated from these realities. His own personal retinue travelled in luxurious enclosed carriages, with their own chefs, laundresses, and even a troupe of court jesters to keep him entertained. He genuinely believed that if his journey was comfortable, then the entire army must be faring equally well. It was a bit like assuming everyone enjoys five-star dining just because you do. The plan, as concocted by Theron and hastily approved by Vorlag, was laughably simple. A direct assault on Viridia's capital bypassing smaller fortifications. Theron envisioned a swift, decisive battle, a glorious charge, and then immediate capitulation. He had even packed a special set of victory robes for the triumphal entry. His strategic understanding was limited to what he had read in romanticised epic poems, where heroes always won and logistics were merely an inconvenient plot device. One quirky historical tidbit from the campaign reports details Theron's insistence on bringing along several dozen barrels of rare vintage wine, for celebratory purposes, despite the army facing severe water shortages. He believed it would improve morale. As the army trudged through the rain-soaked countryside, desertions began to occur. At first, it was a trickle, a single soldier slipping away under the cover of night, driven by hunger or fear for his family back home. Then it became a steady flow, with entire platoons vanishing. The officers, demoralised and often unpaid themselves, turned a blind eye. They knew the men were right to flee, for this was not a war they believed in. They were not fighting for their kingdom, but for the king's bloated ego. The first skirmishes were disastrous. Prince Kael of Viridia, though his forces were smaller, was a seasoned commander who had wisely prepared for Theron's inevitable folly. His soldiers were well trained, highly motivated, and fighting to protect their homes. They used the terrain to their advantage, employing guerrilla tactics and ambushes that bewildered Theron's slow-moving conventional army. Theron, witnessing the initial setbacks from a comfortable distance, became enraged. He blamed his generals, accusing them of cowardice and incompetence, conveniently forgetting that he himself had appointed them based on their flattery rather than their skill. He genuinely believed that if he simply willed victory hard enough, it would manifest. Historians still argue whether Theron's military incompetence was a fundamental character flaw or a symptom of his deep-seated narcissism, which prevented him from acknowledging any weaknesses or learning from mistakes. While it's clear his military knowledge was nil, his refusal to heed expert advice, even when faced with obvious failure, points to a deeper psychological barrier. He saw himself as infallible, and thus any failure must be the fault of others. The common people back home, already suffering, now received news of the defeats. Rumours, always faster than official pronouncements, painted a grim picture of escalating casualties and dwindling resources. The war tax, which Theron had assured them would be temporary, became a permanent drain. The forced conscription continued, tearing more young men from their homes. The hope that this grand foreign adventure might somehow distract from their internal woes evaporated, replaced by a bitter certainty that it was merely accelerating their suffering. Theron, increasingly detached from the grim reality of the battlefield, retreated further into his bubble of self-importance. He would spend hours reviewing battle plans that were entirely divorced from the actual terrain, drawing grand sweeping arrows and confident charges that existed only in his imagination. He would demand detailed reports, not of casualties or tactical movements, but of the heroic deeds of his soldiers, expecting tales of personal valour rather than accurate assessments of the deteriorating situation. When such stories were not forthcoming, he would invent them himself, often regaling Isolde with embellished accounts of battles he hadn't even witnessed. He genuinely believed his fictional heroism was boosting morale. General Vorlag, meanwhile, began to subtly reshape the military hierarchy, promoting loyalists and sidelining those who expressed doubts about the king's leadership. He began to gather intelligence, not just on the enemy, but on the growing unrest within Theron's own ranks, and more importantly within the capital. He was playing a long game, waiting for the king to dig his own grave deep enough for Vorlag to push him in. He would nod politely at Theron's absurd suggestions, then quietly issue his own, more practical, orders to his trusted subordinates, effectively running a parallel command structure. The kingdom's borders, once heavily guarded, were now dangerously thin, with most of the available forces tied up in the doomed Viridian campaign. This left the rural areas vulnerable to banditry and lawlessness, further disrupting trade and agriculture. The few remaining royal guards in the capital were stretched thin, struggling to maintain order amidst the rising tide of public anger. The sight of wounded, defeated soldiers straggling back from the front lines, their faces etched with despair, was a constant damning indictment of the king's folly. They carried not just their physical wounds, but the crushing weight of shattered illusions and a profound sense of betrayal. The commencement of the war, intended as a demonstration of Theron's strength, had instead become a glaring exhibition of his weakness. It had exposed the rot within the kingdom, the depleted treasury, the neglected infrastructure, the demoralised army, and the utterly bankrupt leadership. The cost of this war, measured not just in gold but in blood and tears, was astronomical. And for what? For the sake of a king's wounded pride and his baseless belief in his own military genius. The initial salvos of the Viridian campaign were not merely distant cannon fire. They were the opening volleys in the war against Theron himself, a war he was destined to lose, not to the enemy abroad, but to the consequences of his own monumental foolishness at home. The Grand March had become a funeral procession, though Theron was too busy polishing his breastplate to notice. The news, when it finally reached the capital, arrived not in official dispatches, but on the haggard faces of retreating soldiers, their uniforms torn, their eyes haunted. Crushing defeats were piling up with alarming rapidity, each one a fresh nail in the coffin of Theron's increasingly untenable reign. The Viridian glorification campaign, once a grand illusion, was now undeniably a catastrophe. The first major blow came at the Battle of the Whispering Peaks, a strategic mountain pass Theron had ordered a frontal assault on, against the earnest advice of his more experienced yet ignored generals. Prince Kael's smaller, more agile Viridian forces, intimately familiar with the treacherous terrain, had ambushed Theron's lumbering army, turning the narrow pass into a slaughterhouse. Theron, observing from a safe distance through a newly acquired, highly polished spyglass, mistook the chaos for a tactical retreat by the enemy, only realising his error when the shattered remnants of his vanguard stumbled back, leaving thousands dead or captured. His reaction was not one of humility or strategic re-evaluation, but of furious denial. He publicly scourged the surviving generals, accusing them of cowardice and treachery, despite their desperate attempts to explain the insurmountable odds. He even had one veteran commander who dared to suggest a change in tactics, summarily executed for insubordination. This act, rather than inspiring fear, deepened the resentment within the military ranks. Who would fight for a king who blamed his own soldiers for his strategic blunders? A mainstream historical fact is that poor leadership, particularly a refusal to acknowledge tactical failures and adapt, is a primary cause of military collapse, far more so than a lack of courage among the troops. Theron was meticulously demonstrating this axiom. The subsequent defeats followed a grim pattern. At the Siege of Riverbend, Theron insisted on a direct assault across a swollen river, ignoring reports of Viridian archers dug in on the opposite bank. The result was a massacre, with hundreds of his soldiers swept away by the current or cut down by arrows before they even reached the shore. His brilliant strategy for naval support involved hastily repurposed merchant vessels, which were quickly outmanoeuvred and sunk by Viridia's small but nimble riverine fleet. Theron blamed the river, the weather, and even the alignment of the stars, but never his own ineptitude. He genuinely believed that fate was conspiring against him, not that he was simply terrible at war. It was a bit like blaming the ball for not going into the hoop when you're shooting with your eyes closed. General Vorlag, meanwhile, allowed these defeats to play out, carefully orchestrating his own ascent amidst the chaos. He made sure to be seen offering sage advice that Theron immediately ignored, thereby ensuring that when things went wrong, he could privately tell his confidants, "I told him so." He used each loss as an opportunity to consolidate his power, promoting officers loyal to him, ostensibly to restore discipline, but in reality to build his own personal army within the king's forces. He saw the defeats not as setbacks, but as necessary steps on his path to ultimate control. News of the mounting casualties and the kingdom's dwindling fortunes filtered back to the capital, not just through soldiers, but through desperate letters from families on the front, through returning merchants, and through the increasingly bold grumblings of the common folk. The people saw the daily funeral processions, the influx of wounded veterans begging in the streets, and understood the true cost of Theron's vanity. Morale, already low, plummeted. Public trust in the king, once merely weakened, now shattered entirely. The crown, which Theron wore so carelessly, began to feel like a symbol of oppression, not protection. One quirky historical tidbit from this period is Theron's insistence on receiving detailed daily reports on the number of enemy dead, greatly exaggerated by Vorlag's men to placate him. Theron would then publicly declare these inflated figures as proof of his impending victory, even as his own casualty list grew exponentially. He was living in a self-constructed echo chamber of false triumphs. He even ordered victory celebrations in the capital after minor skirmishes that were, in fact, devastating losses for his own forces, further cementing the public's perception of him as deluded and uncaring. Historians still argue whether the speed of Theron's military collapse was primarily due to his strategic ineptitude or the underlying decay of the kingdom's infrastructure and public will. While Theron's foolish decisions were undoubtedly the immediate cause, the years of neglect, the empty coffers, and the widespread disillusionment meant his army was a hollow shell from the start, destined to crumble under any real pressure. The war simply exposed the rot that had been festering for years. The army itself, once proud, became a demoralised, mutinous rabble. Soldiers, unpaid and starving, began to openly defy orders. Fratricide, desertion, and looting became common occurrences. The concept of loyalty to the crown evaporated, replaced by a desperate instinct for self-preservation. When orders came to march into yet another suicidal engagement, entire units would simply refuse, some even turning their weapons on their own officers. General Vorlag did little to stop this, seeing it as a further weakening of the king's authority. He simply noted the escalating chaos, calculated his next move, and smiled. Meanwhile, back in the capital, Princess Isolde, usually so composed, began to show genuine signs of distress. She saw the increasingly grim faces of the few loyal advisers who remained, heard the mounting clamour from the streets, and understood that her luxurious lifestyle was tied to a rapidly deflating balloon. She began to subtly, desperately urge Theron to seek a peace treaty, to concede defeat and focus on rebuilding. Theron, however, dismissed her pleas as feminine weakness. "My love," he would say, "true kings never surrender. Victory is within our grasp." He genuinely believed his boundless optimism was infectious, rather than deeply unsettling. It was a bit like a captain singing loudly on the deck of a sinking ship, convinced his cheerful tune would somehow refloat it. The defeats had a profound psychological impact on the common people. The initial shock gave way to a simmering rage. They had sacrificed their sons, their food, their meagre savings, for a war that was not only unjust but unwinnable. The constant sight of returning wounded, the stories of senseless slaughter, fueled a deep, burning desire for accountability. The king, once a distant figure of power, was now seen as a tangible, destructive force in their lives. The fear of royal retribution, once so potent, began to wane, replaced by a desperate courage born of having nothing left to lose. The kingdom's allies, those few minor city-states Theron had cajoled into his grand coalition, began to abandon him. Seeing the inevitable defeat, they quietly withdrew their forces, cut off supply lines, and even began to forge new alliances with Prince Kael of Viridia, sensing the shift in power. Theron's international prestige, once based on inherited wealth, now lay in tatters. He was a pariah, a king whose word was worthless and whose military was a joke. The constant string of crushing defeats, the relentless erosion of morale, and the shattering of public trust had brought Theron's kingdom to its knees. The war, meant to elevate him, had instead exposed his utter incompetence and highlighted the rotten core of his reign. Each battle lost, each soldier fallen, was not merely a military setback, but a direct blow to the king's legitimacy and his hold on power. The very fabric of the kingdom was tearing apart thread by bloody thread, and Theron, oblivious to the grand tragedy unfolding around him, continued to plan his non-existent victory parade, a king in a golden bubble, utterly detached from the bitter reality of his own undoing. The breaking point arrived not with a bang, but with a growl, the collective, guttural roar of a people who had endured too much. The steady stream of crushing military defeats, coupled with the king's unwavering indifference and mounting taxes, had finally ignited the fury. What began as isolated grumbles and acts of petty defiance now coalesced into widespread, undeniable rage. The urban centres, particularly the sprawling capital, became cauldrons of discontent, simmering dangerously close to boiling over. The marketplaces, once the vibrant heart of the city, transformed into volatile gathering places. Merchants, with nothing left to sell, mingled with unemployed artisans and gaunt-faced farmers, all united by a common enemy, the king. Whispers about the usurper king and the fool on the throne grew louder, evolving into open denunciations. Pamphlets, crudely printed but filled with venomous accusations, appeared plastered on public walls overnight, blaming Theron for the famine, the war, and the death of their sons. These were not just calls for reform, they were calls for revolution. A mainstream historical fact is that economic hardship, when combined with a perceived lack of legitimate governance and blatant social inequality, often acts as the primary catalyst for popular uprisings. Theron was providing a masterclass in igniting such conditions. The first major manifestation of this fury occurred not in a planned rebellion, but spontaneously, born of sheer desperation. A royal convoy laden with exotic foodstuffs and fine wines, destined for another of Princess Isolde's banquets, attempted to pass through a densely populated working-class district. The sight of plump, unconcerned guards protecting mountains of delicacies while children starved on the streets was too much. A single stone, then a handful, then a volley, rained down on the carriages. The convoy was quickly overwhelmed, the food plundered by the starving crowd. The guards, outnumbered and demoralised, offered little resistance. This incident, minor in scale, was a crucial spark. It showed the people that the king's authority was not unassailable, and it emboldened them. It was a bit like poking a sleeping dragon with a stick, only to find it was already awake and very, very hungry. News of this successful defiance spread like wildfire through the capital's taverns and back alleys. What had been individual acts of desperation now gained a collective power. The small groups that had met in secret now emerged into the open, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. They began to organise not with military precision, but with the raw, chaotic energy of a mob finally unleashed. Their leaders were not seasoned generals or cunning politicians, but charismatic commoners. A fiery blacksmith, a disillusioned scholar, a courageous washerwoman who had lost her entire family to the famine. They spoke with passion and conviction, articulating the people's grievances in plain, undeniable terms. Theron predictably dismissed these incidents as mere criminal disturbances, ordering the royal guard to crack down with extreme prejudice. He dispatched General Vorlag, still outwardly loyal, to suppress the unrest. Vorlag, however, had his own agenda. He used the chaos to identify and eliminate loyalist officers within the guard, replacing them with his own men, all while giving the appearance of enforcing the king's will. He allowed the protests to escalate just enough to further destabilise Theron's rule, without allowing them to fully spiral out of his own potential control. He was playing a dangerous game, walking a tightrope between suppression and calculated neglect. One quirky historical tidbit from the period describes how the rebels, lacking proper weapons, fashioned crude instruments of protest and defiance from everyday objects. Farming tools sharpened into crude axes, kitchen knives tied to sticks, even cobblestones pried from the neglected streets. These improvised weapons, wielded by desperate hands, were far more terrifying than any gleaming royal sword, for they represented the righteous anger of an entire populace. Historians still argue whether the uprising could have been averted had Theron displayed even a modicum of empathy or offered genuine concessions. While the economic and military situation was dire, a different king, one capable of acknowledging error and showing genuine concern, might have been able to hold the tide. Theron's utter lack of self-awareness and his unwavering belief in his divine right meant such a course was never even considered. His fatal flaw was his inability to grasp the concept of public opinion or consent. The protest escalated into full-blown riots. The streets became battlegrounds. Royal Guard patrols were ambushed. Public buildings associated with royal authority, tax offices, granaries filled with confiscated grain, even the palace stables became targets of the people's wrath. The cry was no longer just for food, but for justice, for accountability, for an end to the king's rule. The symbols of Theron's reign, his gilded statues, his elaborate fountains, were defaced and torn down, replaced with crude banners demanding his abdication. Within the palace, the atmosphere shifted from one of oblivious luxury to palpable fear. The sounds of the riots, once distant murmurs, now echoed ominously through the halls. The smug smiles of the courtiers vanished, replaced by pale faces and nervous whispers. Princess Isolde, her composure finally shattered, openly pleaded with Theron to flee, to seek refuge in another kingdom. She saw the writing on the walls, a grim prophecy etched in the smoke rising from the burning districts. Theron, however, remained in a state of baffling denial. He convinced himself that these were merely misguided elements who would soon see the error of their ways. He attributed the chaos to foreign agitators or common brigands, refusing to acknowledge that his own people were rising against him. He genuinely believed that his royal presence, once displayed, would instantly quell the unrest. It was a bit like believing a stern glance would stop a tidal wave. He even considered making a grand public address from a palace balcony, imagining himself calming the furious mob with his majestic words. His few remaining loyal advisers, terrified, managed to dissuade him, fearing he would be met with stones, not applause. They understood, even if he did not, that his image among the people was irrevocably broken. He was no longer a king, he was a symbol of their suffering. The royal guard, spread thin and facing a numerically superior and fiercely motivated populace, began to crack. Many of the lower-ranking guardsmen, themselves from the common folk, sympathised with the rioters. Some simply abandoned their posts, melting into the angry crowds. Others, when ordered to fire on their own people, hesitated, some even refusing outright. The loyalty that had once bound them to the crown was replaced by a sense of shared grievance. The traditional instruments of royal power were failing, not because of superior military tactics, but because the very people meant to enforce them no longer believed in the authority they were defending. The palace itself became a fortress under siege, though the attacks were not yet direct. The roar of the crowds, the distant crackle of burning buildings, and the relentless sound of angry chanting became the new backdrop to Theron's opulent life. He could no longer ignore it, though he still refused to understand it. He believed the people were simply misinformed, or temporarily misguided. He continued to hold lavish meals, though now they were grim, silent affairs, the clinking of silverware accompanied by the ominous sounds from outside. The people's fury, once a smouldering ember, had finally ignited into a roaring inferno. The widespread riots and protests were not just isolated incidents. They were a collective declaration of war against a king who had failed them in every conceivable way. The initial fear of royal retribution had been replaced by a fierce determination to reclaim their dignity and their lives. The tipping point had been reached, and Theron, trapped within his gilded cage, was about to discover the true terrifying power of a people pushed too far. His reign was not just threatened, it was actively being dismantled, brick by bloody brick, by the very subjects he had so foolishly underestimated and abused. The storm had broken, and it was heading straight for the throne. With the capital erupting into chaos, Theron's insulated world began to crack. The distant sounds of the riots were no longer ignorable, nor were the increasingly frantic pleas of Princess Isolde, whose shimmering composure had finally fractured. Her voice, once soft and melodious, was now edged with panic as she urged Theron to consider escape. "Your Majesty," she had pleaded, clutching his arm with desperate strength. "The people! They are not merely upset, they are coming!" Theron, however, remained rooted in a profound, almost pathological denial. He genuinely believed that his royal presence was a magical shield, that the mob, once they saw their king, would simply disperse. His first attempt at escape, if one can even call it that, was less a strategic retreat and more a poorly conceived theatrical flourish. Convinced that a public display of his benevolence would calm the masses, Theron ordered his most ornate carriage, the one usually reserved for grand parades, to be prepared. It was a marvel of gilded wood and velvet, emblazoned with the royal crest, complete with a team of 6 white horses. His plan was to ride through the most volatile districts, throwing handfuls of gold coins to the people, believing this act of generosity would instantly quell their fury. He envisioned cheers, tears of gratitude, and a swift return to his palace, his popularity miraculously restored. It was a bit like trying to put out a roaring inferno with a handful of glitter. His remaining loyal advisers, their faces pale with terror, tried to dissuade him. "Your Majesty," Lord Finch, the Chamberlain, stammered, "the streets are not safe. They are full of unsavoury elements." Theron merely scoffed. "Nonsense, Finch. They are my people. They merely need to see their king." He genuinely believed in the inherent goodness and loyalty of his subjects, a belief completely untethered from reality. Princess Isolde, seeing the futility of argument, simply wept quietly, clutching her children close. The attempt was, predictably, a disaster. As the glittering carriage rolled into the narrow, crowded streets of the lower city, it was met not with cheers, but with a torrent of jeers, rotten vegetables, and eventually stones. The few gold coins Theron tossed out were snatched up, but the act only seemed to enrage the crowd further. They saw it not as generosity, but as a final, mocking insult from a king who had drained them dry. The carriage quickly became a target, its gilded sides dented, its windows shattered. The horses, spooked by the noise and projectiles, reared wildly. Theron, utterly terrified for the first time in his life, screamed for his guards to clear a path. The royal guards, fewer in number than he realised and facing an enraged mob, struggled to protect the carriage. They were overwhelmed, their polished armour no match for the sheer force of desperate human anger. The carriage was eventually forced to turn back, its retreat a humiliating, ignominious scramble back to the dubious safety of the palace walls. Theron arrived back, trembling, his fine robes soiled, his face ashen, finally understanding, perhaps, the true depth of the people's hatred. A mainstream historical fact is that public appearances by unpopular monarchs during periods of unrest often backfire spectacularly, transforming a symbol of authority into a direct target of popular fury. Theron's misadventure was a textbook example. The failure of this desperate gambit plunged Theron into a deeper state of paranoia and erratic behaviour. He no longer ventured beyond the inner sanctum of the palace. His days were now consumed by increasingly frantic and ill-conceived plans to regain control. He'd spend hours poring over maps of the city, not to understand the rebellion, but to draw elaborate lines of defence, convinced that if he could just build enough walls, he could simply outweight the popular fury. He would devise bizarre military strategies involving hidden tunnels and secret sorties, all utterly impractical and born of a mind losing its grip on reality. One quirky historical tidbit from this period involves Theron's obsession with a supposed royal escape tunnel that led from his bedchamber directly to a small hidden boat on the river. He spent days overseeing its restoration, diverting valuable resources and labour to clear out a tunnel that had, in fact, been bricked up for centuries and led only to a disused sewer line. He genuinely believed this secret passage was his ultimate failsafe. Meanwhile, General Vorlag, ever the opportunist, used Theron's increasingly erratic behaviour to his advantage. He would listen patiently to the king's absurd plans, nodding sagely, then quietly issue orders that undermined Theron's authority while appearing to follow them. He began to position his own loyalists within the palace guard, replacing those who remained truly devoted to Theron. He effectively became the de facto commander of the palace defences, though Theron was too self-absorbed to notice the quiet coup unfolding beneath his very nose. Vorlag was preparing not to save the king, but to ensure his own survival and ascendancy. Historians still argue whether Theron was truly delusional by this point, or if his denial was a psychological coping mechanism to avoid facing the catastrophic consequences of his own actions. While his actions certainly suggest a break from reality, some scholars posit that it was a deliberate, if subconscious, effort to maintain his self-image as a powerful, benevolent ruler, even as his world crumbled. He couldn't acknowledge his failures because his entire identity was built upon his inherited superiority. The initial attempts to flee or regain control failed not just because of Theron's incompetence, but because the mechanisms of control he relied upon had already corroded. The royal guard, demoralised and sympathetic to the populace, could not be relied upon. The treasury was empty, meaning mercenaries couldn't be hired. The surrounding nobility, sensing the inevitable, had either fled or were quietly consolidating their own positions, refusing to offer aid to a sinking ship. Theron was increasingly alone, surrounded only by a handful of terrified sycophants and the calculating Vorlag. Princess Isolde, her initial pleas turned to frantic demands, began making her own desperate plans for escape. She discreetly gathered her most valuable jewels and tried to bribe palace staff to arrange for her and her children to flee. She understood that her fate was inextricably linked to Theron's, and his path led only to destruction. She saw the palace not as a refuge, but as a trap, its thick walls serving only to hold them captive. It was a bit like realising the expensive, custom-made suit you're wearing is actually a straitjacket. Theron, increasingly isolated, clung to his delusions with a terrifying tenacity. He would hold court in his grand throne room, though the only attendees were a few trembling servants and the ever-present General Vorlag. He would issue decrees to an imaginary kingdom, demanding loyalty from a populace that was actively trying to overthrow him. He even dispatched messengers to distant, non-existent armies, ordering them to march to his aid. His mind, once merely foolish, was now spiralling into a fantasy world, a self-imposed prison of his own making. The plans to save himself were all predicated on a reality that no longer existed. He believed his power was inherent, his authority absolute, and his people merely misguided. He could not, would not conceive of a scenario where he was truly hated, truly rejected. Each failed attempt to reassert control, each humiliating setback, only pushed him deeper into his isolated madness. The kingdom outside his walls was boiling, preparing to burst, while Theron, inside, meticulously planned defences against imaginary foes, his own foolishness the greatest enemy of all. The walls of his palace, once a symbol of his power, were rapidly becoming the walls of his cage, and he, the foolish monarch, was utterly trapped. The rumble of the approaching mob was no longer a distant threat. It was a visceral, terrifying tremor felt deep within the very stones of the palace. The grand, gilded walls, once symbols of impregnable power, now felt like the crumbling ramparts of a trap. King Theron, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrifying realization, paced frantically through the royal chambers, Princess Isolde clinging to his arm, her own fear a cold, tangible thing. The joyous sounds of courtly life had been replaced by the ominous shouts of the populace, the crash of breaking glass, and the distant crackle of fire. The initial breaches were not through the main gates, which General Vorlag had strategically reinforced, or rather appeared to reinforce, but through the service entrances, the kitchens, and the less guarded sections of the sprawling palace grounds. The sheer weight of numbers, combined with the demoralization and passive resistance of many of the royal guards, proved insurmountable. The first wave of commoners surged in, a desperate tide of farmers, artisans, and women, their faces grim, their makeshift weapons glinting in the pale light. They were not a disciplined army, but a force far more potent, a people utterly driven by hunger and rage. Theron, hearing the shouts drawing closer, ordered his remaining loyal guards to form a perimeter around the inner palace. He genuinely believed that a final, decisive stand would somehow cow the masses into submission. He paced before his trembling guards, attempting to rouse them with fiery speeches about loyalty and divine right, but his words, once echoed by sycophants, now fell flat in the face of imminent danger. The guards looked not at their king, but at the sounds of the approaching fury, knowing their lives were worth more than his lost crown. A mainstream historical fact is that even the most formidable fortresses fall when the will of their defenders crumbles, often due to a lack of belief in the cause or the leader. The palace was not falling to superior siegecraft, but to the weight of collective despair and betrayal. The palace walls began to crumble, not physically at first, but symbolically. The outer courtyards were overrun. The royal aviary, a symbol of Theron's frivolous spending, was ransacked, its exotic birds either set free or caught for food. The royal stables, home to the king's prized horses, were breached, the animals either ridden off or killed. Each fallen gate, each burst door was a further erosion of Theron's rapidly diminishing authority. He could hear the screams, the triumphant shouts, the smashing of fine china. The sounds of his opulent world being systematically dismantled echoed through the halls. Princess Isolde, her jewels clutched in a silk bag, made a desperate attempt to escape through a small, unguarded side door, pulling her children behind her. She knew that her safety, and theirs, lay not with the king, but in fleeing the wrath of the people. Her plan was to rendezvous with a hidden carriage, arranged by a bribed servant, and flee to a distant port. Theron, too consumed by his own terror and denial, barely noticed her departure. He was still convinced that he was the central figure in this unfolding drama, and that his fate was the only one that mattered. It was a bit like an actor so self-absorbed that he doesn't notice the theatre is burning down around him. General Vorlag, ever the calculating pragmatist, allowed Princess Isolde and her children to slip away. He saw no strategic advantage in detaining them, and perhaps even a benefit in demonstrating that escape was possible for some, subtly encouraging other loyalists to scatter and diminish Theron's remaining support. His ultimate goal was the king, and the king alone. He subtly directed his own loyalists to ensure the mob breached specific, less defensible sections of the palace, steering them away from his own prepared positions and towards the throne room itself. He was orchestrating the king's capture, not preventing it, One quirky historical tidbit from this harrowing period describes how the palace kitchens, famous for their lavish banquets, became an unlikely focal point of the uprising. The starving mob, upon finding rooms overflowing with untouched delicacies, burst into a frenzy, devouring food they hadn't seen in years. This immediate primal satisfaction momentarily diverted their attention, but only served to fuel their anger at the king's incredible wastefulness. One rebel was famously quoted shouting, "He feasts on larks while we gnaw on roots." Historians still argue whether the speed and totality of the palace's fall was a testament to the sheer force of popular will, or the result of deliberate manipulation by elements within the military and nobility. While the people's fury was undoubtedly the driving force, Vorla's calculated actions in weakening defences and guiding the mob undoubtedly accelerated the king's demise. It was a perfect storm of popular anger and internal betrayal. As the palace walls truly crumbled, the interior became a scene of chaotic destruction. Priceless tapestries were torn down, antique furniture smashed, and royal portraits defaced. The people, having endured years of oppression and deprivation, unleashed their pent-up fury on the tangible symbols of the king's excess. The very gold and jewels Theron had so foolishly prized were ripped from their settings, carried off as symbols of retribution, or simply trampled underfoot. The grand ballroom, where countless frivolous dances had taken place, became a muddy, chaotic arena. Theron, cowering in his throne room, heard the approaching roar. He was no longer a king, but a terrified man, trapped. He saw the last of his personal guard falter, their faces betraying their terror, their loyalty finally broken. He looked around the room, once the seat of his absolute power, now feeling like a cage. The silence of his inner sanctum was periodically shattered by the sounds of his world being torn apart, piece by gilded piece. He finally understood, with a sickening lurch, that there was no magical shield, no divine protection. He was alone. He made one last pathetic attempt to assert his authority. Clutching his sceptre, he stumbled towards the throne, hoping to sit upon it, to face the inevitable with some semblance of regal dignity. But his legs gave out, and he collapsed in a heap before the ornate chair, the sceptre clattering uselessly to the marble floor. His royal robes, once a symbol of his grandeur, now felt like a suffocating shroud. His eyes, fixed on the ornate doors, were wide with an unadulterated primal fear he had never known. The general staff, those who had not deserted or been replaced by Vorlag, quietly slipped away, melting into the chaos, each hoping to secure their own safety amidst the downfall. They saw no honour in remaining with a king who had so thoroughly engineered his own ruin. General Vorlag, however, stayed. He stood silently in the shadows, a faint smile playing on his lips, watching the king's terror, knowing his moment had come. He had cultivated this chaos, had nurtured the seeds of the people's fury, and now he was ready to harvest the spoils. The palace, once a bastion of order and excess, was now a theatre of retribution. The people were reclaiming what they believed was theirs, not with precise planning, but with the raw, desperate force of accumulated suffering. The crumbling of the palace walls was more than a physical event. It was the symbolic collapse of an entire system, a monarchy that had lost all legitimacy, swallowed whole by the very people it had so carelessly abused. Theron, huddled on the floor of his throne room, finally understood the true meaning of a kingdom in revolt. A terrifying reality he had dismissed for far too long. His reign was over, and the people had come to collect their due. As the roar of the mob swelled, echoing through the ransacked halls, Theron's mind, once solely preoccupied with self-admiration, finally flickered with a desperate spark of something resembling a plan. It was not a brilliant strategy, mind you, but a final, ill-conceived gambit born of pure, unadulterated terror, and a king's inherent, if misplaced, belief in his own theatrical prowess. He recalled an old legend whispered among the court gossips of a hidden cache of ancient royal regalia said to possess mystical powers of persuasion. The items, a legendary crown of unity and a sceptre of harmony, were supposedly capable of calming even the fiercest of rebellions, inspiring awe and loyalty in those who gazed upon them. Theron, utterly devoid of any practical solutions, clung to this superstitious tidbit like a drowning man to a flimsy straw. His plan was simple in its foolishness. Retrieve these mythical artifacts from the deepest, most forgotten vaults beneath the palace, adorn himself in them, and then present himself to the enraged populace. He genuinely believed that the sheer, dazzling spectacle of his divinely sanctioned authority, amplified by these magical objects, would instantly turn the tide. He envisioned the mob falling silent, then kneeling in awe, perhaps even weeping with renewed loyalty. It was a bit like trying to stop an avalanche by waving a sparkly flag. He stumbled to his feet, calling out for Lord Finch, the Chamberlain, one of the few genuinely loyal, if utterly terrified, advisers who had not yet fled. Finch, his face ashen, still clung to his post, a testament to either unwavering duty or sheer paralysis by fear. Theron, breathless, relayed his desperate plan, his voice hoarse with a mixture of terror and delusional hope. Finch, for a moment, looked as if he might faint. He knew the legends, of course, but he also knew they were just that, legends, dusty tales from an age-long past. No real monarch relied on magical artifacts to quell a genuine rebellion, especially not one fueled by starvation and years of oppression. A mainstream historical fact is that many desperate rulers, facing popular revolt, have resorted to symbolic gestures or appeals to ancient traditions, often with little success, precisely because the underlying grievances are too profound to be assuaged by mere pageantry. Nevertheless, Theron was insistent, bordering on hysterical. He dragged Finch towards a hidden passage behind the throne, a secret known only to the monarch and the chamberlain, leading down to the labyrinthine vaults beneath the palace. The descent was cold, damp, and eerily silent, a stark contrast to the cacophony raging above. As they fumbled through the darkness, lit only by Finch's trembling lantern, the sounds of the encroaching mob seemed to fade, replaced by the oppressive silence of ancient stone. Theron, for a fleeting moment, felt a surge of hope. This was it, the secret weapon, the divine intervention he had always believed he deserved. Deep within the vaults, they found a forgotten chamber, thick with dust and cobwebs. Inside, on a pedestal draped in rotted silk, lay the legendary regalia. The crown of unity, a heavy circlet adorned with oddly shaped dull stones, looked less majestic and more lumpy. The sceptre of harmony, a gnarled wooden staff, felt curiously rough and ordinary to the touch. They were not glowing with an inner light, nor did they hum with mystical energy. They simply sat there inert, ancient, and utterly unmagical. One quirky historical tidbit about these very artifacts, a secret known only to a handful of scholars, was that the magical properties were entirely a fabrication by an ancient, long-dead court magician, designed to ensure a steady income from gullible kings seeking easy solutions to their problems. The crown of unity was actually a particularly heavy coronation crown, and the sceptre of harmony was originally a shepherd's crook belonging to a revered saint. Historians still argue whether Theron genuinely believed in the magical properties of the regalia, or if it was merely a desperate act of a man whose mind was finally breaking under pressure. While his preceding actions suggest profound delusion, this particular gambit seems to lean more towards a terrifying last-ditch effort, clutching at straws in the face of absolute despair. It was the frantic final hope of a man who had exhausted all rational options. Theron, however, saw what he wanted to see. He ignored the dullness of the stones, the roughness of the wood. In his mind, these were magnificent, shimmering with power. He stripped off his soiled royal robes and donned the ancient garments beneath his own, his hands fumbling with the unfamiliar fastenings. The crown of unity, far too large for his head, tilted precariously. The sceptre of harmony felt cumbersome in his grasp. He looked less like a divinely chosen monarch, and more like a bewildered child playing dress-up. As he struggled with the weighty crown, the sound of splintering wood echoed from above, followed by a triumphant roar. The mob had breached the innermost defences. Their shouts were now directly above them, shaking the very foundations of the vault. Finch, trembling, urged Theron to reconsider, to find another exit, but Theron was resolute. "No, Finch," he declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and manufactured bravado. "This is our moment. The people will see. They will understand." The plan was not only foolish, but utterly devoid of any practical backup. There was no escape route, no contingency. It was all or nothing, a last desperate roll of the dice in a game he had already lost. He was putting all his hopes into a superstitious belief, ignoring the very real, very angry mob waiting for him. He genuinely believed that the symbols of his past authority would somehow erase the years of neglect and oppression. It was a bit like trying to put out a forest fire by spraying it with a perfume bottle. They emerged from the dark, damp passage into a section of the palace already swarming with enraged commoners. The sheer force of their anger was palpable, a tangible heat that filled the air. Theron, blinded by his own delusion, stepped forward, the crown of unity askew on his head, the sceptre of harmony clutched tight. He raised the sceptre dramatically, expecting silence, perhaps even gasps of awe. What he received instead was a moment of stunned silence, quickly followed by a cacophony of jeers, laughter, and outright derision. The crowd, seeing their king, not as a majestic figure, but as a pathetic, strangely dressed fool, erupted. "Look at the Clown King," someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by hundreds. "He thinks his trinkets will save him," another scoffed. The very sight of his ridiculous appearance, coupled with their long simmering rage, broke any remaining restraint. The crowd surged forward, their improvised weapons raised. Theron, utterly bewildered, could not comprehend their reaction. His magical artifacts, his glorious presence, had failed him. He stood there, frozen, his face a mask of shock and dawning despair as the angry tide washed over him. Finch, seeing the inevitable, screamed and tried to pull Theron back, but it was too late. The final, desperate gambit had not merely failed, it had accelerated his downfall, transforming him from a king into a punchline, a figure of scorn and ridicule. The crown of unity offered no protection, and the sceptre of harmony brought only discord. His last pathetic hope had been dashed, and the true nightmare was only just beginning. As the screaming tide of humanity surged into the throne room, sweeping aside the last demoralized remnants of the royal guard, Theron found himself utterly exposed. His final gambit, the ancient unmagical regalia, had not only failed to inspire awe, but had provoked a fresh wave of derisive laughter, turning him into a pathetic caricature in the eyes of his enraged subjects. But the immediate threat wasn't solely from the furious populace. From the shadows, a more insidious danger emerged, the calculated betrayal of his closest confidants. General Vorlag stepped forward, his expression a carefully neutral mask. He had allowed the mob to breach the inner sanctum, had even subtly directed them, ensuring that the king would be trapped, utterly alone, in the very heart of his power. Now, as the first wave of commoners swarmed towards the trembling monarch, Vorlag raised a hand. The roar of the crowd surprisingly quieted, a testament to his quiet authority, cultivated over months of strategic positioning. This was his moment, the culmination of his patiently executed plan. A mainstream historical fact is that palace coups often coincide with popular uprisings, with ambitious figures exploiting widespread chaos to depose a weakened ruler and seize power for themselves. Vorlag was playing this classic game with ruthless precision. "Hold!" Vorlag commanded, his voice cutting through the remaining din. The crowd, momentarily confused, paused. Their anger was directed at the king, not at this stern, authoritative general who had for months subtly distanced himself from Theron's follies. Vorlag then turned his gaze, cold and unwavering, to Theron, who still stood, dishevelled and bewildered, the crown of unity askew. "Your Majesty," Vorlag announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "it seems your people have a message for you. A message you have, for too long, refused to hear." This was the public betrayal, the dramatic flourish that cemented Vorlag's control. He wasn't just standing by, he was actively facilitating Theron's downfall, presenting himself as the logical, capable alternative. The few remaining courtiers who had huddled in terror watched in horrified fascination. Their expressions shifted from fear to a dawning understanding, then to a quick, almost imperceptible calculation. They recognized the inevitable shift in power and began, subtly, to adjust their allegiances. Some even offered nervous, almost imperceptible nods of approval towards Vorlag, hoping to catch his eye. It was a bit like watching a predator patiently stalk its prey, then deliver the final decisive blow. Theron, however, still couldn't quite grasp the depth of the treachery. His mind, trapped in its self-serving narrative, struggled to process Vorlag's actions. "Vorlag, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered, his voice weak and reedy, completely lacking its usual regal resonance. "Arrest these rabble. They dare to defy their king." He genuinely believed that Vorlag was simply demonstrating his control over the mob, rather than delivering him into their hands. Vorlag merely offered a cold smile. "The days of arresting the rabble are over, Your Majesty. The people have spoken, and their will, it seems, is far stronger than your decrees." He then turned back to the crowd, his voice resonating with authority. "This man," he declared, pointing a contemptuous finger at Theron, "has led you to ruin. He has squandered your wealth, starved your children, and sent your sons to die in a foolish war. He is no longer fit to rule." The crowd erupted in a roar of agreement, their fury now channeled, focused by Vorlag's pronouncements. One quirky historical tidbit from accounts of this moment is that as Vorlag spoke, Theron instinctively reached for his crown, attempting to straighten it, a pathetic attempt at maintaining dignity even as his world collapsed. This small gesture, observed by many, only served to highlight his clueless vanity. He was still worried about appearances when his very life hung in the balance. Historians still argue whether Vorlag's actions were a calculated long-term conspiracy or an opportunistic move made in the moment. While his gradual consolidation of power suggests a degree of foresight, the sheer chaos of the uprising likely presented him with a faster, more decisive path to control than he had initially envisioned. He seized the moment, and he seized it decisively. The betrayal wasn't limited to Vorlag. As the general spoke, other figures emerged from the shadows. Disgruntled minor nobles, ambitious officers who had been overlooked by Theron, even some members of his household staff who had endured years of his dismissive arrogance. They stepped forward, one by one, to publicly denounce him, listing his follies and abuses. The accusations, once whispered behind silk fans, were now shouted in the open, confirming every dark rumour the people had heard. A cook recounted how the king had once thrown a plate of perfectly good roasted pheasant at him for a perceived culinary imperfection while his family starved. A stable master detailed how prized war horses were left unfed, while Theron's pampered ponies ate oats laced with honey. These personal grievances, combined with the larger systemic failures, painted a damning portrait of a truly foolish and cruel monarch. Theron watched, aghast as his world disintegrated around him. He looked from Vorlag to the faces of the accusers, then to the surging mob, his mind finally, painfully, grasping the reality of his situation. He was not merely dethroned. He was utterly abandoned, betrayed by those he had trusted, or rather those he had taken for granted. The isolation he had cultivated through years of self-absorption now became a terrifying, tangible prison. There was no one left to defend him, no one to lie for him, no one who truly cared. The palace guards, seeing their former king so utterly vulnerable, and sensing the shift in power, either laid down their arms or openly sided with Vorlag. The few who had clung to a fragile sense of loyalty now realized the futility of their position. They faded into the background, leaving Theron completely surrounded by his accusers and the triumphant mob. The clatter of dropped weapons was a grim punctuation mark on the end of his reign. Princess Isolde by now was likely far from the palace, making her own desperate way towards freedom. Her silent betrayal, the discreet gathering of her jewels and her children, was perhaps the most poignant, for it revealed that even the woman he believed loved him unconditionally had in the end chosen her own survival over his. She was, in her own way, as calculating as Vorlag, simply with a different set of priorities. The public humiliation was complete. Theron, stripped of his authority, his dignity, and his loyalists, stood alone amidst the roaring crowd. The grand, opulent throne room, once the stage for his elaborate fantasies, had become the arena for his final, devastating reckoning. The betrayal from within the court, orchestrated by Vorlag and amplified by the grievances of 1,000 small indignities, had ensured that when the people finally stormed his palace, they found not a defiant king, but a pathetic, utterly broken man ready to be delivered to his ignominious fate. The trap had sprung, and Theron, the foolish monarch, was caught. The moment of capture was less a dramatic struggle, and more a pathetic collapse. Theron, stripped of his final delusions by Vorlag's chilling pronouncement and the open contempt of his former servants, offered no resistance. As the angry populace surged forward, their shouts of "Justice! Justice!" echoing through the shattered throne room, Theron crumpled. He was not seized by a heroic leader of the rebellion, nor by a disciplined squad of soldiers. Instead, he was simply swallowed by the tide of humanity, a flailing, whimpering figure in overly large ancient robes. His crown of unity tumbled from his head, rolling across the marble floor like a forgotten toy, finally coming to rest against the ornate leg of his own overturned throne. He was pulled roughly to his feet, not by hands that respected his former station, but by calloused, angry grips that showed no deference. The velvet and silk of his garments, already soiled, were further torn as he was jostled and shoved. The once sacred figure of the king was now merely another body in the crowd, albeit one subjected to an intense collective loathing. He was spat upon, cursed, and subjected to a torrent of verbal abuse that had been bottled up for years. The physical discomfort, however, was nothing compared to the searing humiliation. He saw the faces of the people he had so casually dismissed, now contorted with rage, and for the first time, perhaps, truly understood the depth of his folly. A mainstream historical fact is that fallen monarchs, especially those perceived as tyrannical or incompetent, often face intense public vitriol, a psychological release for years of suppressed anger. Theron was experiencing this catharsis firsthand. General Vorlag, ever in control, quickly moved to exert his authority over the unruly mob. He understood that uncontrolled chaos could easily turn against him. With a series of sharp commands, he instructed his loyalists, now interspersed within the populace, to secure the king. Theron was hoisted onto the shoulders of several strong, grim-faced men, not in triumph, but in a deliberate act of public spectacle. He was paraded through the very palace he had so meticulously adorned, past the shattered remnants of his own extravagance. Every broken statue, every overturned banquet table, every defaced portrait of himself served as a grim tableau of his undoing. The procession was slow and agonizing. Theron's eyes darted nervously, taking in the destruction, the jubilant cries of the common folk as they ransacked the symbols of his power. He saw women wearing his queen's discarded gowns as mocking capes, men drinking from royal goblets, and children gleefully smashing porcelain figurines that had once cost a fortune. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his kingdom's hatred washed over him. He was no longer a king, he was a trophy, an object of collective vengeance. One quirky historical tidbit from the oral accounts of the time details how a small boy, no older than 5, managed to grab the king's sceptre of harmony as it fell, and, with surprising strength, snapped it cleanly in half over his knee, to the thunderous applause of the surrounding crowd. It was a potent symbolic act of rejection. The journey through the city streets was even more harrowing. Word of the king's capture had spread like wildfire, and the streets were packed with an unyielding sea of humanity. Theron was not allowed the dignity of a closed carriage. He was marched barefoot and exposed through the very boulevards where he had once held lavish parades. The people threw not just insults, but handfuls of mud, rotten fruit, and even refuse. He stumbled, was pushed, and nearly fell multiple times, only held upright by the firm hands of his captors. His fine garments were now rags, stained and torn. His face, once plump and unlined, was streaked with dirt and tears. The transformation from majestic monarch to humiliated captive was complete, brutal, and utterly public. Historians still argue whether the public humiliation of Theron was a necessary act to break the illusion of divine monarchy, or a descent into mob rule that foreshadowed later, darker events. While undeniably brutal, it served a purpose for the revolutionaries, to demonstrate unequivocally that the king was no longer untouchable, no longer sacred. It was a stark message to any who might still harbour loyalty. The destination of this grim procession was not a dungeon, but the grand public square, usually reserved for royal proclamations and festive celebrations. A makeshift gallows, hastily erected but undeniably sturdy, now dominated the centre. Before it stood a crude wooden platform clearly visible to the thousands who packed the square, overflowing into every alleyway and onto every rooftop. This was not a secret imprisonment. This was a public display, a meticulously choreographed act of dethronement and judgment. As Theron was finally forced onto the platform, the noise of the crowd reached a deafening crescendo. He squinted against the bright, unforgiving sun, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, searching for any sign of sympathy, any flicker of recognition from a face he might have once known. There was none. Only hatred, contempt, and a chilling collective triumph. His royal ring, still on his finger, was roughly yanked off by a masked figure who held it aloft. displaying it to the roaring crowd before crushing it underfoot. The gesture was clear. No more authority, no more power. General Vorlag, now standing beside the platform, addressed the crowd. His voice, calm and resonant, cut through the din. He spoke of justice, of liberation, of a new era for the kingdom, an era free from the tyranny of a foolish king. He did not explicitly condemn Theron to death at this moment, but his words certainly painted a vivid picture of the king's egregious failures, effectively cementing the public's desire for his absolute removal. He cast himself as the reluctant saviour, the one who stepped in when the king had failed. Theron, standing before the very people he had ignored and abused, was a pathetic figure. He shivered, despite the warmth of the day, his fear a cold tremor deep within his bones. He attempted to speak, to perhaps plead, but no words would come. His throat was dry, his tongue seemed stuck, and the sheer force of the public's rage utterly silenced him. He was mute finally after a lifetime of speaking without thinking. The public humiliation continued for hours. He was forced to listen to denunciations, to the recounting of his numerous blunders and cruelties, each tale met with renewed roars of anger from the crowd. He was presented with the gaunt, starving faces of children, with the tattered clothes of peasants, with the broken tools of artisans, each a silent, damning accusation. The spectacle was designed to break him, to strip him of every last shred of dignity and self-delusion, and it succeeded. The king who had once believed himself untouchable was now a mere mortal, utterly exposed, utterly reviled. His capture and public display were not just events, they were the final, brutal lesson in the consequences of his reign. The grand public square, usually a vibrant hub of market chatter and celebratory festivals, now buzzed with a grim, expectant energy. A hastily convened tribunal had been assembled, less a court of law, and more a stage for the kingdom's collective reckoning. King Theron, his once magnificent robes tattered and stained, was prodded onto the crude wooden platform, the hastily erected gallows looming ominously behind him. His face, once plump and arrogant, was now a mask of bewildered terror, streaked with dirt and dried tears. He was no longer a king, he was an exhibit, the central figure in the mock trial of a monarch who had spectacularly failed. The judges were not robed magistrates from the defunct royal courts, but a diverse collection of common folk chosen by acclamation from the leaders of the uprising. There was the fiery blacksmith, a gaunt farmer who had lost his entire harvest, a former royal scribe whose family had starved, and a formidable washerwoman whose hands, usually busy with laundry, now gripped a heavy wooden gavel. Their faces were etched with the collective suffering of the kingdom, and their eyes held no mercy. This was justice, raw and visceral, unburdened by legal niceties or ancient traditions. A mainstream historical fact is that revolutionary tribunals often prioritize symbolic retribution and public validation over traditional legal process, serving to delegitimize the old regime and solidify the new order. Theron's trial was a potent example of this phenomenon. The accusations, instead of being read from dry legal scrolls, were shouted directly from the crowd. Voice after voice, from every corner of the square, rose in a chorus of grievances. A woman screamed about the jewel tax that had starved her children. An old man, his voice cracking with emotion, recounted the loss of his son in the disastrous Viridian campaign. A former merchant decried the Edict of Harmonious Hues that had ruined his trade. Each accusation was met with roars of agreement from the thousands gathered, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of the washerwoman's gavel, a chilling sound that echoed Theron's impending doom. Theron, subjected to this relentless barrage, could only whimper and occasionally shake his head in feeble denial. He tried to speak, to perhaps offer an explanation or a defence, but his voice was drowned out by the sheer volume of public fury. He looked at the faces, searching for any glimmer of understanding, any hint of the adoration he had always assumed was his right. He found only condemnation. He genuinely believed that if he could just explain himself, they would understand his benevolent intentions, utterly failing to grasp that his intentions, benevolent or not, had led to their suffering. It was a bit like trying to apologise for setting a house on fire by explaining you only meant to light a cosy candle. General Vorlag, still maintaining his detached, authoritative demeanour, stood to the side observing the spectacle with a keen, calculating eye. He had ensured Theron was delivered to this public platform, making sure that the king's downfall was seen as a popular uprising, not a military coup. He allowed the crowd to vent its full fury, knowing that this catharsis was essential for the new order to take root. He was, in essence, directing a play, with Theron as the unwilling tragic lead. He made sure his own loyalists were prominent in the crowd, their cheers and denunciations louder than the rest, steering the narrative. One quirky historical tidbit from accounts of the trial describes how Theron, at one point, tried to appeal to his divine right, pointing a trembling finger to the heavens and invoking the names of his ancestors. The crowd responded with mocking laughter, some even throwing small harmless projectiles at him. The concept of divine right, once unshakable, had been utterly shattered by his own foolishness. It meant nothing to people whose lives had been ravaged by his earthly decisions. Historians still argue whether Theron, in his final moments on the platform, truly understood the magnitude of his failures, or if his denial remained unbroken. While his terror was evident, his lifelong insulation from consequences suggests a deep psychological inability to fully internalise blame. He likely felt betrayed and unfairly targeted, rather than genuinely remorseful for his actions. It's plausible he saw himself as a victim of circumstance, rather than the architect of his own destruction. The accusations piled up: financial ruin, military catastrophe, the edict of harmonious hues, the constant lavish spending, the callous disregard for famine and plague. Each point was elaborated upon by a member of the tribunal, weaving a tapestry of incompetence and cruelty. They spoke not in legal jargon, but in the plain, brutal language of everyday suffering. They held up empty bread baskets, tattered garments, and crudely carved wooden crosses representing the dead. The evidence was not abstract, it was painfully tangible. Theron, standing amidst this onslaught, became increasingly agitated. He wrung his hands, his eyes darting frantically. He was forced to listen to the testimony of a woman who described how her children had wasted away, their bellies swollen from hunger, while the king hosted banquets filled with roasted swans. He heard a veteran, his leg missing from a battle in the Viridian campaign, recount the king's detached orders that sent his friends to their pointless deaths. Each story was a fresh wound, tearing at the thin veil of his self-deception. The proceedings were swift and merciless. There were no appeals, no lengthy deliberations. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, echoing the will of the masses. After a final, thunderous chorus of accusations, the washerwoman judge raised her gavel high. Her voice, usually soft from endless hours of laundry, boomed across the square. "King Theron," she declared, her eyes burning with a righteous fury, "you stand accused by your own people of tyranny, neglect, and crimes against the very kingdom you swore to protect. You have brought ruin, suffering, and death. For these grave offences, the judgment of the people is clear." A collective intake of breath swept through the square. Theron, trembling uncontrollably, stared at the washerwoman, a look of desperate, pleading terror in his eyes. He tried to muster a final protest, a last pathetic appeal to his royal blood, but only a choked gasp escaped his lips. "The judgment," the washerwoman continued, her voice unwavering, "is that you are hereby stripped of all titles, all authority, and all claims to this throne. You are King Theron no more. You are merely Theron, a common man judged by the common people, and your fate is sealed by your own hand." The gavel slammed down with a resounding crash, a sound that reverberated through the very bones of the square, signifying the end of an era and the definitive judgment of a foolish monarch. The roar that followed was one of grim satisfaction, of justice, finally irrevocably served. Theron, the man who had once believed himself above all earthly judgment, now stood condemned by the very people he had so carelessly governed. The gavel's final resounding thud echoed through the square, a death knell for Theron's reign, and perhaps for the foolish king himself. The roar of the crowd, a primal sound of collective triumph, washed over him, drowning out any remaining flicker of self-delusion. Stripped of his titles, his crown, and his dignity, Theron was no longer your majesty. He was simply Theron, a condemned man, utterly broken by the weight of his people's judgment. He swayed on the platform, his eyes wide and vacant, as if the sheer force of their hatred had physically knocked the sense out of him. The formal pronouncement of his sentence, delivered by the washerwoman judge with chilling resolve, was not a swift decree of execution, but something far more agonizing, a symbolic act designed to utterly strip him of his past. "Theron," she declared, her voice resonating with the conviction of 1,000 wronged souls, "you are to be publicly disrobed of your final remnants of royal finery, your symbols of power destroyed before your very eyes. You will witness the true cost of your foolishness, laid bare for all to see." This was a judgment rooted in the revolutionaries' need for catharsis, a public undoing of every opulent lie Theron had lived. A mainstream historical fact is that revolutionary regimes often perform elaborate public rituals of dethronement, burning effigies, smashing symbols, and forcing the deposed ruler to witness the destruction of their former power, all designed to break the psychological hold of the old order. First, his tattered royal robes were roughly pulled from his shivering frame. The silk, once vibrant, now clung to him in soiled strips. As each layer was removed, a gasp went through the crowd, not of shock, but of grim satisfaction. He was left in simple, coarse undergarments, a stark contrast to the luxurious attire he had worn his entire life. The sight of his pale, unmuscled body, unsuited for any real labour, further emphasised his detachment from the common people's daily struggles. He was just a man, after all, and a rather pathetic one at that. Next came the symbols of his personal vanity. His collection of signet rings, each bearing a different ornate crest, was ripped from his fingers, then thrown into a waiting fire pit on the edge of the platform, the precious metals melting into slag. The ornate jewel-studded buckles from his shoes, which had somehow remained, were pried off and crushed under the heel of the blacksmith judge. Even his carefully styled, once luxurious hair was roughly shorn by a rebel with a rusty knife falling in clumps to the blood-stained wood. Theron flinched with each indignity, but offered no resistance, his spirit utterly crushed. The most poignant and perhaps most excruciating part of his judgment came with the display of the kingdom's true suffering. One by one, grim-faced citizens approached the platform, holding up tangible symbols of Theron's folly. A farmer displayed a small shriveled ear of corn, explaining how it was all that remained of his harvest after the king's tax collectors had taken their due. A weaver held up a bolt of vibrant green cloth, now forbidden by the Edict of Harmonious Hues, explaining how his family was destitute. A mother, her eyes red-rimmed, presented a faded toy soldier, representing the son lost in the pointless Viridian War. Each item, simple yet devastatingly eloquent, was a silent, damning indictment. Theron was forced to look into their eyes, to bear witness to the pain he had so carelessly inflicted. He genuinely believed that his wealth had somehow cushioned them, and seeing their actual raw poverty was a shock to his insulated worldview. One quirky historical tidbit from this period recounts how a group of street performers, usually relegated to entertaining the common folk, were brought to the square. Instead of their usual cheerful acts, they performed a satirical mime of Theron's extravagant life, exaggerating his foolishness and vanity to the delight and fury of the crowd. They mocked his love of fine foods by miming endless gluttony, his obsession with fashion by prancing in ridiculous oversized hats, and his military blunders by pretending to trip and fall while brandishing toy swords. This public mockery served to further strip Theron of any remaining mystique. Historians still argue whether Theron experienced genuine remorse during this public ordeal, or if his reactions were simply manifestations of extreme fear and self-pity. While he certainly displayed terror, an adorning, painful understanding of the public's hatred, true empathy or repentance for the suffering he caused is less clear. His lifelong narcissism was a formidable barrier to profound self-reflection, even in the face of utter ruin. He seemed more horrified by his fall than by their suffering. The culmination of the judgment was the destruction of the symbols of his absolute power. A giant, crudely carved wooden effigy of Theron, adorned with discarded royal trinkets, was dragged into the square. Beside it, the shattered pieces of his magnificent gold-plated breastplate, the broken fragments of his diamond-encrusted doorknob, and the twisted remains of his gilded peacocks were piled high. A rebel leader, a former scholar with a powerful voice, addressed the crowd. "These are the idols he worshipped," he thundered, pointing at the pile. "These are the symbols of his neglect. Let them be consumed, as his reign has been consumed by his own folly." With a roar, the crowd cheered as torches were applied. The effigy quickly caught fire, its painted face contorting in the heat, a grotesque reflection of Theron's own fear. The gold-plated fragments, the jewels, and the broken remnants of his extravagant life melted and twisted in the flames, their beauty consumed by the raging inferno. The smoke, thick and acrid, drifted over the square, a bitter perfume marking the end of an era. Theron was forced to watch, his eyes wide with a terrible fascination, as the material manifestations of his foolishness turned to ash. It was a terrifying, tangible representation of the kingdom's burning hatred. As the fire consumed the last vestiges of his reign, a collective sigh, almost a whisper, swept through the crowd. The raw fury had subsided, replaced by a grim, exhausted satisfaction. Justice, in their eyes, had been served. Theron, no longer a king, no longer even a symbol of power, was merely a man standing on a platform stripped bare, his world reduced to ashes before him. He was no longer dangerous, merely pitiable. The judgment had been delivered, and Theron, the man who had lived a life of unchecked privilege and profound ignorance, was now facing the full, terrifying weight of the consequences. His public humiliation was complete, his reign utterly and irrevocably dismantled. The next step, the final walk, awaited him, and he, the foolish monarch, had nowhere left to hide. His legacy was already being written, not in glorious epic poems, but in the ashes of his own extravagant, disastrous reign. The chill of the morning air, unfamiliar and biting on his exposed skin, was a stark contrast to the pampered warmth of his bedchambers. Theron, no longer king, no longer adorned in silks and jewels, was led from the public square, his arms bound, his bare feet stumbling on the rough cobblestones. His public condemnation had been complete, his humiliation absolute. Now came the final walk, the grim procession that would etch his name into history not as a glorious monarch, but as the foolish king, a cautionary tale whispered through generations. The route chosen for his final journey was deliberately symbolic. It snaked through the very districts he had once ignored, the famine-stricken artisans' quarter, the crowded slums where disease festered, and the market streets where trade had withered under his absurd decrees. Every turn brought him face to face with the tangible consequences of his reign. He saw the skeletal frames of children, the desperate eyes of mothers, the vacant stares of men broken by hunger and war. Each face was a silent, damning accusation. He genuinely believed that the common people existed in some hazy, contented state, and the direct, undeniable evidence of their suffering now forced its way into his sheltered consciousness, a horrifying panorama of his own making. It was a bit like someone finally being forced to look at the wreckage of a car crash they caused, after years of driving away. The procession was slow, agonizingly so. It was designed not for speed, but for maximum exposure. The crowds were immense, lining every street, filling every window. Unlike the initial frenzy of the palace storming, this crowd was quieter, more sombre, a collective presence of judgment rather than outright rage. There were still jeers, certainly, but also a chilling silence, a palpable sense of grim satisfaction. Theron could feel their eyes on him, 1,000 burning points of retribution, and he shivered despite the thin warmth of the morning sun. General Vorlag, mounted on a dark, powerful horse, rode silently behind Theron, a stern and imposing figure. He ensured order, not out of mercy for the fallen king, but to maintain the solemnity of the occasion. This was his moment of ascendancy, the public crowning of his new authority, and he would not allow it to be marred by unseemly chaos. He was now the master of the city, and his controlled presence spoke volumes about the new order. A mainstream historical fact is that the final public appearance of a deposed monarch is often meticulously managed by the new powers to both legitimize their own rule and solidify the narrative of the old regime's deserved downfall. Vorlag was executing this political theatre with cold precision. Theron tried to shut out the faces, the accusations, the brutal reality of his situation. He focused on the rough cobblestones beneath his feet, each step a jarring reminder of his sudden descent. He remembered his soft, carpeted palace floors, the slippered comfort of his former life, and the contrast was a physical torment. His mind, however, kept replaying snippets of his past. The banquets, the jewels, the fawning courtiers, the beautiful Princess Isolde. He saw them not as follies now, but as lost treasures, a life stolen from him. He still couldn't fully grasp that he had been the thief. One quirky historical tidbit from eyewitness accounts mentions a moment when Theron passed by a small, dilapidated bakery. The aroma of fresh bread, a scent he usually ignored, suddenly filled his nostrils. He instinctively tried to reach out as if to grab a piece, before his bound arms reminded him of his helplessness. The baker, a gaunt woman, simply stared at him with cold, empty eyes, a silent indictment more powerful than any shouted accusation. It was a mundane detail, but for Theron it was a stark, brutal reminder of the simple sustenance he had denied his people. Historians still argue whether Theron's final moments of perceived awareness represented a true awakening or merely a terrified realization of consequences without genuine empathy. While his fear was profound and undeniable, it's difficult to ascertain if he truly understood the systemic suffering he had caused, or simply regretted the loss of his own comfortable existence. His tears, if any, were likely for himself. The route led them past the decaying infrastructure, the collapsing bridges he had ignored, the neglected public fountains that no longer flowed, the derelict schools and hospitals that had been stripped of funds. Each crumbling structure was a monument to his misrule, a silent testament to the wealth diverted to his own indulgence. He saw the very foundations of his kingdom, quite literally falling apart, and the sight was more terrifying than any army. As the procession continued, Theron's physical strength began to wane. His shoulders slumped, his steps grew heavy. He was forced to lean on his captors, a king reduced to a burden. The cold, the hunger, the overwhelming sense of shame, all combined to drain him. His once vibrant imagination, usually so adept at constructing elaborate fantasies, now conjured only the grim realities of his impending end. He thought of his last meal, a lavish affair in the palace, and the stark emptiness in his stomach now seemed like a cosmic irony. He passed the very spot where he had attempted his foolish carriage ride into the city only weeks before. The memory of the stones and insults, the shattered gilded carriage, flashed through his mind, and a fresh wave of terror washed over him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that there was no miraculous escape, no last-minute reprieve. His final gambit had failed, and now he was truly alone, walking towards his fate. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the square, illuminating the makeshift gallows at its centre. This was the final destination. The air grew heavy with anticipation, a collective holding of breath from the thousands gathered. Theron's eyes, unfocused and glazed with terror, fixed on the structure. He had seen gallows before, of course, for common criminals and traitors, but never had he imagined he would stand beneath one. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was prodded up the few wooden steps, each creaking under his weight. The silence of the crowd was absolute, a chilling stillness that felt heavier than any roar. He stood on the platform, his back to the gallows, facing the vast sea of faces. His gaze fell upon the washerwoman judge, her face hard and unyielding. Beside her stood the blacksmith, the farmer, the scribe, all the faces of the people he had wronged, now witnessing his final terrible moments. His life, a cascade of privileges and follies, flashed before his eyes. The indulgent childhood, the self-serving reign, the grand romance that masked his neglect, the disastrous war, the desperate, pathetic attempts to flee, the public humiliation. It all culminated in this single, terrifying moment. He was no longer a king, not even a symbol. He was simply Theron, facing the ultimate consequence of being history's most foolish monarch. His final walk had brought him to the precipice, and he had nowhere left to fall but into the abyss of infamy. The sun, which had mercifully offered a fleeting warmth during his humiliating procession, now beat down relentlessly on the wooden platform. Theron stood, shivering not from cold, but from sheer, unadulterated terror. He faced the vast, silent sea of faces, his breath catching in his throat. The gallows, stark and menacing, loomed behind him, a grim punctuation mark on the end of his life sentence. This was it, the final act of history's most foolish monarch. The executioner, a silent, imposing figure whose face was obscured by a heavy hood, stepped forward. He carried no axe, no sword, but a simple length of rough rope, coiled and ominous. Theron's eyes fixed on it, mesmerized by its cruel simplicity. He had always imagined death to be a distant concept, something that happened to others, certainly not to a king. The reality, raw and terrifying, was a visceral shock. He genuinely believed that his royal blood, his very essence, protected him from such a common undignified end. It was a bit like assuming the laws of gravity wouldn't apply to you because you owned a particularly fancy hat. Before the final act, however, General Vorlag stepped forward, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't speak of execution, but of the indelible lesson Theron's life offered. "This man," Vorlag declared, his voice resonating across the square, "has taught us the true cost of unchecked vanity and indifference. His reign, built on privilege and sustained by delusion, has brought this kingdom to its knees. Let his downfall be a testament to the power of a people united, and a stark warning to any who would wield power without wisdom or compassion." This was Vorlag's final act of legitimation, cementing the narrative for the new order. A mainstream historical fact is that the public execution of a monarch, while rare, served as a profound symbolic act, irrevocably severing ties with the old regime and establishing the absolute authority of the revolutionary government. It was less about punishment and more about a societal reset. Theron, hearing Vorlag's words, looked at the general, a flicker of something akin to recognition in his eyes. He finally understood the depths of Vorlag's machinations, the quiet, patient manoeuvring that had led him to this very platform. It was a chilling realization, one that added another layer of bitter understanding to his final moments. He had been a pawn in a game he never even knew he was playing. One quirky historical tidbit from accounts of the day speaks of a single white dove, startled by the sudden hush of the crowd, circling high above the square before flying off towards the distant palace, a fleeting, almost poetic symbol of escape from the grim reality below. Theron, in his terror, might have been the only one to notice it, a momentary, painful distraction. Historians still argue whether Theron's final moment saw a true moment of clarity, a profound understanding of his responsibility, or if he remained fundamentally self-absorbed to the very end. While his terror was undeniable, the depth of his self-delusion throughout his life suggests that any understanding was likely focused more on his own terrifying fate, rather than genuine remorse for the widespread suffering he had caused. He was facing his death, not reflecting on their lives. The executioner approached, and Theron flinched, his body tensing. He closed his eyes as if by doing so he could make the reality disappear. He could hear the murmur of the crowd, the whisper of the rope, the thumping of his own heart, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He thought of Princess Isolde, safe now, far away, and a pang of something akin to regret for their lost future flickered within him, though it was quickly overshadowed by his own immediate overwhelming fear. His legs buckled and he nearly fell, only to be steadied by the executioner. He was guided to the edge of the platform, the rope placed around his neck. The wood beneath his feet felt rough and splintered. He opened his eyes and his gaze swept across the silent, unyielding faces one last time. There was no pity, no mercy, only the grim satisfaction of a debt finally paid. He was a cautionary tale, living out his final, horrific lesson. The long-term impact of Theron's reign, or rather his spectacular fall, was profound. It shattered the illusion of absolute monarchy, demonstrating that even a divinely appointed king could be judged and condemned by his own people. The subsequent government, led by General Vorlag, who swiftly consolidated power and declared himself the new protector of the realm, was forced to acknowledge the will of the populace, at least outwardly. The memory of Theron, the foolish king, became a potent deterrent against future royal excesses. No subsequent ruler dared to be as utterly detached, as blatantly self-indulgent, or as carelessly cruel. The experience of the famine, the disastrous war and the king's final humiliation etched a deep scar on the collective memory of the kingdom. It fostered a new, wary relationship between ruler and ruled, one where the people understood their own power, even if they had paid a terrible price to learn it. His name, Theron, became synonymous with incompetence, vanity, and ruin. Parents would warn their children, "Don't be a Theron," when they showed signs of heedlessness. Scholars would write treatises dissecting his every blunder, creating a veritable curriculum of kingly errors. His legacy was not one of monuments or grand achievements, but of the stark, enduring lesson of consequences. The vast, intricate palace, once a testament to his opulence, was eventually converted into public archives, its grand halls filled with the history he had so spectacularly failed to make. His story serves as a timeless reminder that power, when wielded without wisdom, empathy or accountability, is not a shield but a weapon that will ultimately turn upon its wielder. He was a king who could not see beyond his own reflection, a monarch so consumed by his private fantasy that he allowed his entire world to crumble. He believed his people existed to serve him, never once considering that he was meant to serve them, and in the end they served him his just deserts. Welcome back, you night owls. As the echoes of history fade and the grand foolish dance of power concludes, take a moment to let the story settle. The weight of King Theron's tale, a testament to the colossal cost of unchecked arrogance and indifference, is heavy indeed. The imagery of his fall, the cries of a people pushed to their limits, slowly recedes, replaced by a quiet stillness. Imagine the dawn breaking over that troubled kingdom, a new day, perhaps uncertain, but undeniably free from the shadow of the foolish king. The air softens, the last of the dramatic tension dissipates, and you're left with the quiet hum of a lesson learned, a whisper of caution from the annals of time. Let the final moments of this journey bring a sense of peace, knowing that even in history's darkest hours, there is always the promise of a new beginning, a chance for wisdom to triumph over folly.